It began with confidence that was already hollow. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, beneath snow-laden branches and skies thick with cloud, the German army launched what it believed would be a decisive blow, a final gamble powerful enough to reverse years of retreat and loss. Maps were spread across tables lit by dim lamps. Arrows were drawn boldly westward. Timetables were set with rigid certainty. The plan promised surprise, speed, and shock. It promised momentum so overwhelming that the Allies would fracture before they could respond. For a brief moment, even in the depths of winter, that belief felt real. But belief is not the same as reality. The German Ardennes offensive did not fail because of a single mistake. It failed because of many pressures pressing at once. It failed slowly, then suddenly. It failed in silence, in snow, in fuel gauges falling toward empty. It failed not only on the battlefield, but in planning rooms, supply depots, weather reports, and assumptions that no longer matched the world as it truly was. At first, everything seemed to work. American positions were surprised, front lines bent under pressure, villages fell faster than expected, roads filled with advancing columns. The Bulge formed, stretching westward like a wound reopening. For a few tense days, the forest belonged to the attackers. Low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. Snow and fog masked movement. German infantry moved through trees with discipline and urgency. Tanks emerged from mist where no one expected them. The Allied front wavered, unsure where the next blow would fall. But beneath that early momentum, cracks were already spreading. The plan demanded speed in terrain that punished it. The Ardennes was narrow, wooded, and unforgiving. Its roads twisted through valleys that funneled armor into bottlenecks. Its hills slowed vehicles never meant for steep, icy climbs. Traffic jams formed almost immediately, vehicles stacked bumper to bumper on frozen roads where a single breakdown could stall an entire division. Time slipped away with every delay. And fuel, always fuel, became the silent enemy. German tanks advanced carrying just enough gasoline to reach objectives that existed more on paper than on the ground. Captured Allied fuel depots were expected to solve shortages, but many were destroyed, empty, or unreachable. Engines burned fuel faster in winter conditions. Detours consumed precious reserves. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were damaged, but because they were empty. Entire formations slowed, then stopped. Momentum began to bleed out into the snow. Meanwhile, the Allies adapted with startling speed. American commanders stabilized the front by sacrificing ground for time. Units were rushed in from quiet sectors. Roads were blocked, bridges destroyed, towns turned into strong points. Small groups fought delaying actions that forced German columns to deploy, to stop, to burn fuel and time they could not replace. Places like Bastogne became symbols, not because they were meant to be held, but because holding them broke the rhythm of the offensive. Encircled, frozen, and outnumbered units refused to collapse. They anchored the battlefield, forcing German forces to divert strength and attention away from their main thrust. And then the sky changed. The weather that had protected the offensive turned against it. Clouds lifted. Snow gave way to clear, bitter cold. Sunlight revealed columns packed tightly onto narrow roads, perfect targets. Allied aircraft returned in overwhelming numbers, striking stalled convoys, fuel trucks, bridges, and armor trapped with nowhere to hide. Every bomb destroyed more than steel. It destroyed movement. It destroyed supply. It destroyed hope. The German command structure strained under the weight of these realities. Orders issued from afar did not match conditions on the ground. Units lost contact with one another. Objectives shifted daily. Coordination broke down as formations fought isolated battles with no clear sense of the larger picture, and all the while, the Allies grew stronger. Artillery concentrations increased, fresh divisions arrived, logistics flowed freely behind secure lines. Counterattacks began to form, first cautious, then decisive. The offensive that was meant to split the Allied front now found itself stretched thin, vulnerable along its flanks. German units that had pushed deepest were suddenly the most exposed, fighting not toward victory, but toward survival. Retreat routes clogged, fuel vanished, ammunition ran low. The same forest that had hidden the advance now trapped the withdrawal. Winter took its toll as well. Cold killed engines. Cold froze wounded men where they lay. cold slowed movement until exhaustion became constant. The Ardennes did not care which uniform a soldier wore. By the time the offensive collapsed, it did not collapse with drama. It faded. It stalled. It reversed direction, mile by mile. What remained was devastation. Forests shredded by artillery, villages reduced to rubble, roads littered with abandoned vehicles. The Bulge slowly flattened as Allied forces pushed back to their original lines and beyond. Germany had spent its last strategic reserve in a gamble it could not sustain. The failure of the German Ardennes offensive was not the failure of courage. It was the failure of resources, of timing, of geography, of logistics, of leadership disconnected from reality. It marked the moment when hope gave way to inevitability. Tonight, we return to that failure, not to mock it, not to simplify it, but to understand it, to see how momentum can be created and how easily it can be lost, to examine how war is decided not just by bravery, but by supply, weather, coordination, and truth, to understand why this final gamble did not change the course of the war and why it could never have done so. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something quiet and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has settled around you? Is it late where you are, with the world finally slowing down, or is the day still holding on? And if these long, reflective journeys through history help your thoughts slow, your breathing soften, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. The air inside the Wolf's Lair bunker smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. On November 10, 1944, deep within the forests of East Prussia, Adolf Hitler's trembling hands spread a massive military map across the conference table. His fingers, shaking from advancing Parkinson's disease, traced a red line westward through the Ardennes forest, across the Meuse River, all the way to the Belgian port of Antwerp, a distance of 450 kilometers through enemy-occupied territory. The generals surrounding him, Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and the recently summoned Field Marshal Gerhard von Rundstedt, stared at the map in stunned silence. What they were witnessing wasn't military planning, but the desperate fantasy of a man who refused to accept that his empire was dying. Hitler's voice, still commanding despite his deteriorating health, filled the underground chamber with absolute certainty. He announced Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deceptive name meant to suggest defensive preparations, while concealing the largest German offensive operation since the invasion of France 4 years earlier. The plan called for 3 entire armies, roughly 250,000 men, to smash through the weakly defended Ardennes sector and drive to Antwerp in a single, massive thrust. The objective wasn't merely tactical. By capturing Antwerp, Hitler believed he could cut off supplies to 35 Allied divisions, split the British and American armies, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. Then, with his Western Front stabilized, he could transfer forces eastward to stop the Soviet juggernaut rolling toward Berlin. On paper, it looked like the recreation of the stunning 1940 victory that had brought France to its knees in 6 weeks. But the generals knew what Hitler refused to acknowledge. Germany was losing 6,000 soldiers every single day on the Eastern Front alone. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, had been reduced to fewer than 2,000 operational aircraft, with pilots averaging a mere 60 hours of flight time compared to the Allies' 300. Fuel reserves had dwindled to a 3-week supply for the entire Wehrmacht. Field Marshal Walter Model, summoned to command Army Group B for the offensive, listened to Hitler's briefing and later confided to his staff that the plan was damn dangerous and hasn't got a leg to stand on. Rundstedt, Germany's most senior field commander, was more blunt in private. This plan hasn't got a damned leg to stand on. Yet, neither man dared contradict the Führer directly. The culture of fear that Hitler had cultivated meant that even Germany's most experienced military minds were reduced to silent witnesses as he planned what they knew would be a catastrophe. The arithmetic of the operation revealed its fundamental impossibility, though Hitler dismissed such concerns as defeatism. The offensive would require capturing at least 2.5 million gallons of Allied fuel within the first 48 hours, just to maintain momentum. Without those captured supplies, the panzers would run dry before reaching the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. German intelligence estimated the Americans had massive fuel dumps throughout the Ardennes sector, left vulnerable by what they perceived as American carelessness. What Hitler didn't know or chose not to believe, was that Allied supply officers had contingency plans to destroy these dumps at the first sign of German attack. The entire offensive rested on the assumption that American forces would be so shocked and disorganized that they would abandon millions of gallons of fuel intact. It was strategic planning built on wishful thinking rather than military reality. The forces being assembled for the operation represented the last significant mobile reserve the Third Reich possessed. The 6th Panzer Army, under the fanatical Josef Sepp Dietrich, would strike on the northern shoulder with the mission of reaching the Meuse in 2 days. The 5th Panzer Army, under General Hasso von Manteuffel, would attack the center, while the 7th Army protected the southern flank. Together, they fielded approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, including 45 of the massive King Tiger tanks, 70-ton monsters with nearly impenetrable armor and devastating 88mm guns. 12 of the 30 divisions were Volksgrenadier units, hastily trained replacements with minimal combat experience, filled with teenagers and men in their 40s. The SS Panzer divisions were elite, battle-hardened on the Eastern Front, but they were also exhausted, under strength, and equipped with tanks that consumed fuel at catastrophic rates. Hitler personally designed every aspect of the operation, forbidding his generals from suggesting modifications. When Model proposed a less ambitious operation, a double envelopment to destroy American forces east of the Meuse without attempting to reach Antwerp, Hitler rejected it as thinking small. When Rundstedt suggested waiting until spring when better weather might allow the Luftwaffe to provide air support, Hitler insisted the attack must happen in December, while Allied forces were still recovering from their autumn offensives. The Führer had convinced himself that the Allies were on the verge of collapse, that one massive shock would shatter their coalition. He cited the temporary alliance between the capitalist West and communist East as proof that the enemy coalition was unnatural and fragile. One decisive blow, he insisted, and Churchill and Roosevelt would come to the negotiating table. It was the reasoning of a man disconnected from reality, yet he possessed absolute power to turn his delusions into orders that would send hundreds of thousands to their deaths. The timeline for the offensive reflected Hitler's detachment from military practicalities. His planning staff calculated that German panzers could reach the Meuse River in 48 hours if they encountered only light resistance. From there to Antwerp required another 5 days of sustained advance, meaning the operation needed to secure its final objective within a week. Historical analysis shows this was never realistic. The terrain of the Ardennes, heavily forested hills crisscrossed by steep valleys and narrow roads, naturally channeled armored advances into predictable routes. American forces, even if surprised, could establish blocking positions at key road junctions and river crossings. The entire plan assumed that American troops would panic and flee, that their commanders would be paralyzed by confusion, and that reinforcements couldn't possibly arrive in less than a week. Each of these assumptions would prove catastrophically wrong. The Luftwaffe's role in the offensive revealed another layer of desperate optimism. Hermann Göring promised that 3,000 aircraft would support the ground offensive, achieving temporary air superiority through sheer numbers even if pilot quality was inferior. The reality was far grimmer. Only 1,200 aircraft could actually be committed to the operation, and most of those could fly only a single sortie before running out of fuel. The Allied air forces had nearly 15,000 operational aircraft in Western Europe, along with pilots who had been flying combat missions for years. German planning counted on heavy cloud cover and winter storms to ground Allied aircraft for 7 to 10 days, giving the offensive time to succeed before American and British fighter bombers could intervene. They were gambling everything on the weather forecast, a level of risk no competent military plan should accept. Yet, meteorologists had predicted a period of heavy clouds starting around December 16th, and Hitler seized on this as providence. Security for the operation was maintained through draconian measures. Hitler ordered that no written plans were to exist below army level, meaning division and regimental commanders wouldn't know their objectives until days before the attack. Radio silence was absolute. Troop movements happened only at night, with all vehicles traveling without headlights. Entire panzer divisions were hidden in the forests of the Eifel region, camouflaged beneath trees and netting. The deception worked. American intelligence detected increased German activity but interpreted it as preparations for a defensive battle, not an offensive. The Allies had convinced themselves that Germany was too weak, too depleted to launch a major attack. This intelligence failure would prove nearly as consequential as Hitler's strategic delusion. Both sides were operating on false assumptions, setting the stage for one of the most chaotic and bloody battles of the Second World War. What happened in that bunker on November 10th would set in motion a chain of events that would kill more than 89,000 American soldiers, destroy Germany's last strategic reserve, and ultimately hasten the Third Reich's collapse. Hitler had designed an operation that could only succeed if everything went perfectly, and the enemy did everything wrong. His plan required flawless execution, perfect weather, complete surprise, captured fuel supplies, demoralized American troops, and Allied command paralysis. It needed all of these things simultaneously for an extended period across hundreds of kilometers of contested terrain. The slightest deviation from this optimistic scenario would doom the entire enterprise. Standing in that bunker, watching Hitler's trembling finger trace the route to Antwerp, men like Model and Rundstedt already knew they were witnessing not a plan for victory, but a prescription for disaster. Yet, they would follow their orders, commit their armies to this impossible task, and watch as mathematical reality crushed strategic fantasy. The die was cast. The offensive would launch in 5 weeks, and nothing could stop it now. The forests of the Eifel region transformed into a vast military staging ground as December arrived. In the early hours of darkness, beneath the thick canopy of evergreen trees, an entire army group assembled in near-perfect silence. The rumble of tank engines, the clanking of tracks, the shouts of officers directing traffic, all the normal sounds of military movement were suppressed or muffled by strict noise discipline. Oberst Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando leader, and the man who had rescued Mussolini from captivity the previous year, moved among special units receiving final briefings in English. His operation, codenamed Griffin, would deploy 2,000 hand-picked German soldiers disguised in captured American uniforms, driving stolen jeeps with orders to spread chaos behind enemy lines. The main offensive would be spectacular, but Skorzeny's commandos would make it legendary. The scale of the assembly defied belief given Germany's supposed exhaustion. 3 entire armies, the 6th SS Panzer Army, 5th Panzer Army, and 7th Army, concentrated along a 200-kilometer front that the Americans had designated as a quiet sector for rest and training. Approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns rolled into position, including the newest and most powerful armored vehicles Germany had ever produced. 45 King Tiger tanks, each weighing 70 tons, and mounting the fearsome 88mm gun, represented the spearhead of the SS Panzer divisions. Supporting them were Panthers, Mark II, IVs, and a variety of assault guns. On paper, this armored force appeared formidable. In reality, many of the tanks were plagued by mechanical issues. Their crews were increasingly inexperienced, and every single vehicle consumed fuel at rates the German supply system could no longer sustain. The deception operation surrounding the offensive demonstrated German operational security at its finest. False radio traffic suggested a major attack was being prepared near Cologne, far to the north of the actual assault sector. Wooden artillery pieces and dummy tanks were positioned in areas where Allied aerial reconnaissance might photograph them. Real units maintained absolute radio silence, communicating only through motorcycle couriers and landline telephones. Movement to the front occurred exclusively at night, with vehicles traveling without headlights through the forest roads. Tank engines were started only when Allied aircraft were heard overhead, masking the distinctive sound under the noise of enemy planes. Local civilians in the assembly areas were evacuated or confined to their homes under threat of execution for revealing military information. It was a masterclass in operational concealment, and it worked beyond German expectations. American intelligence failed to detect the gathering storm, despite numerous warning signs. On December 13th, an American truck driver named William Tsakanikas was captured while making a wrong turn near the German lines. Under interrogation, he reported seeing massive tank concentrations, supply dumps, and artillery preparations. His report reached 12 Corps intelligence, where analysts concluded he was either lying to appear important or had been deliberately shown preparations for a local counterattack. The same day, a captured Belgian resistance fighter warned that a major German offensive would occur between December 15th and 20th. This report did reach SHAEF headquarters in Versailles, but it was filed as unreliable because the source couldn't be verified. The British Ultra program, which had been reading German Enigma communications throughout the war, detected Luftwaffe squadrons moving westward from Germany. But Montgomery's intelligence staff concluded this was a defensive redeployment, not preparation for offensive operations. The German order of battle told a story of desperate commitment. The 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich, was the strongest formation with 9 divisions, including 4 SS Panzer divisions, filled with Nazi ideologues and Eastern Front veterans. These men had fought in some of the war's bloodiest battles and brought with them an attitude of ruthless determination mixed with casual disregard for the laws of war. The 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel was smaller but more professionally commanded, with 7 divisions including 3 panzer divisions. Manteuffel was a brilliant tactical commander, perhaps the best Germany still fielded, and he had convinced Hitler to modify the artillery preparation in his sector. The 7th Army's mission was purely defensive, hold the southern shoulder and prevent American counterattacks from disrupting the main thrust northward. The quality of German infantry had deteriorated dramatically from the force that had conquered France in 1940. 12 of the 30 divisions committed to the offensive were Volksgrenadier units, People's Infantry, created from the remnants of destroyed divisions, walking wounded returned to service, sailors without ships, and Air Force personnel made redundant by fuel shortages. Many soldiers were 16 or 17 years old, with as little as 6 weeks of training. Others were men in their 40s, dragged from reserved occupations because the Wehrmacht's manpower crisis had become terminal. These units were equipped with the new assault rifles and Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, giving them considerable short-range firepower, but they lacked the cohesion, experience, and combat leadership that had characterized earlier German formations. They would fight, and many would die bravely, but they were not the soldiers who had steamrolled across Europe 4 years earlier. Skorzeni's commando operation added a layer of psychological warfare to the offensive. His Einheit Stielau, Special Unit Stielau, named after a dead SS officer, had been recruiting since October. The requirements were extraordinary. Perfect command of American English, including slang and regional dialects, knowledge of American culture and military procedures, and willingness to fight in enemy uniform, despite the certainty of execution if captured. The unit struggled to find enough qualified personnel. Many English speakers turned out to know only a few phrases. Skorzeny eventually assembled about 2,000 men, supplemented by 10 captured American Sherman tanks and 30 jeeps. Their missions ranged from seizing bridges over the Meuse River to spreading false orders and cutting communications lines. The most ambitious rumor, carefully spread through the unit, suggested they would drive to Paris and assassinate Eisenhower himself. It was a lie designed to be captured during interrogation and create maximum paranoia. The final element of German preparation was the Luftwaffe's contribution, codenamed Operation Bodenplatte, baseplate. The plan called for a massive coordinated strike against Allied airfields on January 1st, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground and achieving temporary air superiority. For this single mission, Göring had hoarded nearly 2,000 aircraft, pulling fighters from air defense duties over the Reich itself. The pilots ranged from highly experienced aces to recent graduates with barely enough training to take off and land. Fuel for one mission, possibly 2 if they were lucky, had been carefully stockpiled. After that, the Luftwaffe would effectively cease to exist as an offensive force. It was another all-or-nothing gamble, burning the future to fund one last roll of the dice. Intelligence estimates of Allied strength suggested the offensive faced favorable odds. German reconnaissance reported only 4 American divisions in the Ardennes sector, spread across 88 miles of front, roughly 3 times the doctrinal width for effective defense. The divisions identified were either inexperienced units sent to quiet sectors for training or exhausted formations pulled from heavy combat for rest and refitting. The 99th Infantry Division had been in Europe for less than a month. The 106th Infantry Division had just arrived from the United States, its troops fresh from training camps. The 4th and 28th Infantry Divisions were recovering from the brutal Hurtgen Forest battles. German planners calculated they could achieve local superiority of 3 or 4 to 1 at breakthrough points, overwhelming American defenses before reinforcements could arrive. What they didn't know was that behind these thin front lines, Eisenhower had positioned powerful armored reserves capable of rapid deployment. By mid-December, everything was in position. The Shadow Army crouched in the forests, waiting for the signal to attack. Meteorologists confirmed their predictions. Heavy cloud cover would arrive on December 16th and persist for approximately a week. Artillery had been meticulously positioned, with crews calculating firing solutions for every American strongpoint identified through reconnaissance. Infantry assault troops had been issued extra rations and ammunition, enough for 3 days of intense combat. Tank commanders received their fuel allocations, barely enough to reach the Meuse if they encountered light resistance and didn't get lost. The plan's fundamental weakness, its dependence on capturing enemy fuel, was known to everyone from Hitler down to Panzer Battalion commanders. But the operation was happening regardless. In the final hours before H hour, scheduled for 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, thousands of German soldiers tried to sleep in frozen forests, contemplating the attack that would begin with the largest artillery barrage the Western Front had seen since the Great War. Many wrote final letters home, sensing they were about to participate in something momentous, though whether it would be a glorious victory or a catastrophic defeat, no one could say with certainty. Snow fell gently on the small Belgian town of Clairvaux as evening approached on December 15th, 1944. In the town's medieval castle, officers of the 110th Infantry Regiment enjoyed a rare luxury, a regimental officers' club with a functioning bar and gramophone playing big band music. The regiment was part of the 28th Infantry Division, a Pennsylvania National Guard unit that had been savagely mauled in the Hurtgen Forest battles throughout November. They had been pulled back to this quiet sector of Luxembourg and eastern Belgium to rest, absorb replacements, and prepare for future operations. Tomorrow was supposed to be another routine day of light patrolling and defensive improvements. The soldiers settling into their foxholes that night had no idea they were positioned directly in the path of 3 German divisions preparing to attack at dawn. The Ardennes sector had earned its designation as a ghost front through months of relative inactivity. Eisenhower's strategic plan concentrated Allied strength for major offensives to the north and south. Bradley's 12th Army Group was preparing to push toward the Rhine, while Devers's 6th Army Group conducted operations in Alsace. The Ardennes, with its rugged terrain of steep hills, dense forests, and winding river valleys, was considered unsuitable for major combat operations. Montgomery himself had declared it bad tank country, where armor couldn't be employed effectively. This assessment led to a calculated risk: stretch thin forces across the Ardennes to free up divisions for the main effort elsewhere. Major General Troy Middleton's Corps received responsibility for 88 miles of front, a distance that military doctrine said should be held by at least 3 full corps. The 4 divisions defending this extended front presented a study in contrasts. The 4th Infantry Division, holding the southern portion, was experienced and capable, but under strength after heavy fighting. The 28th Infantry Division in the center was recovering from catastrophic losses in the Hurtgen Forest, where it had suffered 8,000 casualties in 3 weeks. The 106th Infantry Division, just arrived from the United States, held critical positions around the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, despite having never experienced combat. The 99th Infantry Division, barely a month in Europe, occupied positions to the north. Together, these divisions fielded approximately 83,000 men to defend a front where 250,000 Germans were about to attack. The mathematics alone suggested disaster. Life in the Ghost Front bore little resemblance to the brutal combat occurring elsewhere. American soldiers enjoyed hot meals brought forward from rear area kitchens, regular mail delivery, and even occasional passes to towns like Bastogne for showers and entertainment. The daily routine involved improving defensive positions, conducting small patrols to maintain contact with German forces, and enduring the miserable weather of a Belgian winter. Artillery fire was so infrequent that expenditure was limited to 5 rounds per gun per day, and those were often registration rounds rather than combat fire. Soldiers wrote letters home describing their sector as boring and quiet as a cemetery. Some units organized Christmas parties, expecting to celebrate the holiday in relative peace. This complacency wasn't negligence, but the natural result of orders emphasizing that the sector was for rest and recuperation. Intelligence officers were less sanguine, but struggled to make their concerns heard. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Reeves, serving in the 28th Division's intelligence section, had been compiling reports of increased German activity for weeks. Prisoners captured in local skirmishes mentioned seeing tanks moving westward. Belgian civilians reported hearing vehicle convoys at night. Patrols detected new minefields being laid and wire obstacles being improved. Aerial reconnaissance, limited by poor weather, occasionally glimpsed what appeared to be supply buildups. Each report in isolation seemed minor, but collectively they suggested something significant was developing. Reeves briefed his findings to division headquarters, which forwarded them to Corps, which sent them to 1st Army headquarters. At each level, the information was evaluated and largely dismissed. The prevailing intelligence assessment held that Germany was finished as an offensive threat. The terrain itself shaped American defensive preparations in ways both helpful and limiting. The Ardennes is not flat farmland, but a region of steep-sided river valleys covered in dense forest. Roads twisted through narrow defiles where a single disabled vehicle could halt an entire column. Rivers like the Our, Sauer, and Klurf ran swift and cold, requiring bridges or fords that became natural defensive choke points. American engineers had prepared these bridges for demolition, wiring them with explosives that could be detonated if German forces attacked. Infantry companies held key villages and ridgelines, but the distances between positions were often measured in kilometers rather than meters. Communication depended on field telephone lines strung through the forests, vulnerable to artillery fire. Radio communication was hampered by the terrain and unreliable equipment. This meant that once fighting started, small unit commanders would be largely on their own. The quality of American troops varied dramatically across the sector. Veterans of the 4th and 28th Divisions knew their business, understood how to construct proper defensive positions, and could be counted on to fight effectively even when surprised. But these divisions were shadows of their former strength. Companies that should field 200 men mustered perhaps 120. Sergeants led platoons, lieutenants commanded companies. The replacement system kept units nominally at strength by feeding in individual soldiers fresh from training camps. But these men lacked the cohesion and experience that made units effective. The 99th and 106th Divisions were worse off. Entire regiments had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their troops were physically fit, well-equipped, and motivated, but combat effectiveness comes from experience they simply didn't possess. Artillery support, normally the great equalizer in defensive battles, existed in insufficient strength. Doctrine called for one artillery battalion to support each infantry regiment, with corps-level artillery providing additional firepower as needed. In the Ardennes, artillery was spread thin and often positioned too far from the front to provide effective support. Ammunition stockpiles were modest because the sector wasn't expected to see heavy fighting. Fire plans existed for defensive scenarios, but they assumed relatively small-scale German attacks, not the massive artillery preparation that was about to fall on American positions. The gunners were competent and their equipment excellent. The 105mm and 155mm howitzers were proven weapons, but they couldn't be everywhere at once, and they were about to be vastly outnumbered by German artillery. Behind the front lines, the reserve situation revealed Eisenhower's strategic gamble in stark terms. The 7th Armored Division, veteran and capable, was positioned in the Netherlands, available to respond to threats in the Ardennes, but requiring hours or even days to arrive depending on road conditions. The 10th Armored Division was in Luxembourg, closer but already committed to supporting Patton's Third Army operations. Other armored divisions were engaged in heavy combat around Aachen or refitting after autumn battles. Eisenhower had positioned his forces for offensive operations, accepting risk in the Ardennes because he fundamentally believed Germany could no longer launch major attacks. This wasn't stupidity or negligence, but a calculated decision based on intelligence assessments that proved catastrophically wrong. The reserve forces existed and would respond quickly once the battle began, but they wouldn't be in position when the offensive started. As darkness fell on December the 15th, American soldiers along the Ghost Front settled into their evening routines. Guard rotations were posted, machine guns were positioned covering likely approaches, mortar crews stacked ammunition within easy reach. In battalion and regimental command posts, officers reviewed the next day's patrol schedules and supply requisitions. The chaplain of the 110th Infantry Regiment began preparing for Sunday services he would never deliver. In the village of Bastogne, 28 miles behind the front, support troops enjoyed what they believed was a secure rear area, completely unaware that within a week, their town would become the most famous siege of the Western Front. The night was cold and quiet, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch breaking under accumulated snow. Across the valley, hidden in the German forests, artillery crews made final preparations for a barrage that would shatter this peace and transform the Ghost Front into what soldiers would call the Bulge, the calm before the storm was ending. In less than 8 hours, the largest battle American forces would fight in World War II would begin with earth-shaking violence. The first shells began falling at exactly 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944. Private First Class Richard McKee of the 99th Infantry Division, huddled in his foxhole near Losheimer Graben, remembered the sound decades later. The ground shook, the trees shook, everything shook. 1,600 German artillery pieces and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers opened fire simultaneously across 88 miles of front, hurling 65,000 rounds at American positions in the first 90 minutes. The barrage could be heard 30 miles away. Trees exploded into splinters. Foxholes collapsed, burying their occupants. Communications lines, strung through the forest on telephone poles, were severed in hundreds of places within minutes. The Ghost Front died in fire and thunder, and what emerged from that maelstrom was chaos. The artillery preparation followed patterns refined on the Eastern Front, where Soviet defenses had taught Wehrmacht gunners how to maximize psychological as well as physical destruction. High-explosive shells targeted command posts, communication nodes, and road junctions. White phosphorus rounds set forests ablaze, creating walls of flame that isolated American units. Nebelwerfer batteries, their rockets screaming through the air with a distinctive wailing sound that earned them the nickname Screaming Memes, concentrated on forward infantry positions. But the most unnerving aspect was the artificial moonlight. German troops had positioned searchlights behind their lines, aimed at low-hanging clouds. The reflected light created an eerie illumination across the battlefield, bright enough for the advancing infantry to see their way through the pre-dawn darkness. It was a technique borrowed from the Eastern Front, and it worked with terrifying effectiveness. The infantry assault began before the artillery fire lifted. Volksgrenadier divisions advanced in dense formations, accepting heavy casualties to close with American positions quickly. They came forward singing Nazi marching songs, their voices carrying through the smoke and explosions. In some sectors, they achieved complete surprise, overrunning American outposts before defenders could react. At other points, veterans of the 4th and 28th Divisions held their fire until German troops were within 50 yards, then opened up with every weapon they had. Machine guns scythed through the advancing ranks. Mortar rounds plunged into the packed formations. But for every German who fell, 2 more appeared from the smoke. The weight of numbers was overwhelming, and the Volksgrenadiers had been told this was Germany's last chance. Fight now, or face annihilation when the Allies crossed the Rhine. By mid-morning, the battle had fragmented into hundreds of small, desperate fights. At Lanzerath, a reconnaissance platoon of 18 men from the 99th Division held off an entire German battalion for nearly a day, killing or wounding hundreds before being overrun. At Losheim Gap, the boundary between the 99th and 14th Cavalry Group, German assault troops punched through a weak point in American defenses and poured westward. The 106th Division, positioned on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, found itself under attack from 3 sides as German forces penetrated to its north and south, beginning an encirclement that would doom 2 entire regiments. Communications breakdown meant that higher headquarters received only fragmentary reports. Heavy attack, many casualties, falling back. The full scope of the disaster was still invisible to American commanders. Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, demonstrated what elite troops could accomplish when everything went right. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper commanded approximately 100 tanks, Panthers, Mark IVs, and the massive King Tigers, supported by 2,000 infantry in half-tracks. His orders were brutally simple: reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, regardless of losses or obstacles. At 6 in the morning, his lead elements smashed through positions held by the 394th Infantry Regiment near Lanzerath. American troops, already reeling from the artillery barrage, watched in horror as the first King Tigers appeared from the morning mist. These 70-ton monsters were nearly invulnerable to the standard American anti-tank weapons. Bazooka rockets bounced off their frontal armor. Even the excellent 76mm guns on American Sherman tanks struggled to penetrate them. The collapse of American positions varied by unit and location. Green troops of the 99th and 106th Divisions often broke and retreated when attacked by overwhelming force, not from cowardice but from the natural human reaction to chaos, terror, and the absence of experienced leadership to hold them steady. Veterans held their ground longer, exacting heavy casualties from attacking Germans, but even they had to fall back when flanking movements threatened encirclement. The speed of the German advance created pockets of American troops cut off from their units, wandering through forests trying to find friendly lines. Some of these men would spend days behind German lines before escaping or being captured. Others formed impromptu defensive positions and fought where they stood, creating unexpected obstacles to German movement. By noon, the situation had deteriorated beyond anything American commanders had contemplated. The 99th Division's front had been penetrated in multiple places, though stubborn resistance at key points slowed German follow-on forces. The 106th Division was being systematically encircled on the Schnee Eifel, its two forward regiments, 14,000 men, soon to be cut off. The 28th Division's center had crumbled, opening a gap through which German armor was pouring westward. The 4th Division to the south held more successfully, but it too faced overwhelming pressure. Major General Troy Middleton, commanding a V8 Corps from Luxembourg, received report after report of breakthrough and disaster. By early afternoon, he understood what had hit him. Not a local counterattack, but an Army group-sized offensive. He immediately requested reinforcements from 1st Army headquarters. The German advance by nightfall revealed both the power and limitations of the offensive. At the deepest penetration points, lead elements had driven 8 to 10 kilometers into American territory, a significant tactical success. Piper's Kampfgruppe had crushed resistance and was racing westward, with minimal opposition ahead. German divisions had broken through at 6 critical points along the front. Thousands of American soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. Entire artillery batteries overrun, tank destroyers abandoned, supply dumps captured intact. Yet the advance had not proceeded according to Hitler's optimistic timeline. Resistance, even from Green troops, had consumed precious hours. Traffic jams developed as multiple divisions tried to use the same narrow roads through the Ardennes terrain. Ammunition expenditure during the assault exceeded carefully calculated reserves, raising questions about sustainability. The American response demonstrated the resilience of a military system built on flexibility rather than rigid planning. Within hours of the initial assault, Eisenhower's headquarters began redirecting forces toward the Ardennes. The 7th Armored Division received orders to move from Holland to St. Vith, a 100-mile road march through winter conditions. The 10th Armored Division prepared to deploy from Luxembourg. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, refitting in France after Operation Market Garden, were alerted for immediate deployment. Strategic reserves that would take days to arrive were already moving, but their speed of response reflected an organizational capacity that Germany had lost. The Wehrmacht could plan and execute a brilliant attack opening, but it lacked the logistical depth to sustain operations while simultaneously responding to counterattacks. America could absorb devastating tactical defeats and respond with overwhelming force. The question was whether that force would arrive in time. As darkness fell on December the 16th, both sides assessed the day's results through very different lenses. German commanders saw tactical success, breakthrough achieved, American forces reeling, roads to the Meuse opening before them. They had inflicted perhaps 15,000 American casualties and seized dozens of square kilometers. But they had also consumed a full day of their tight timeline, burned through ammunition and fuel at rates exceeding calculations, and encountered resistance that suggested American forces wouldn't simply collapse as hoped. American commanders saw tactical disaster, divisions broken, thousands of men missing, Germans advancing on multiple axes toward critical objectives. But they also saw a military machine responding with coordination and speed, reserves moving, defensive positions being prepared at depth. The battle's first day belonged to Germany. Whether they could sustain that success for the week required to reach Antwerp was a different question entirely. As exhausted soldiers on both sides collapsed into frozen sleep, the Battle of the Bulge was only beginning. At 4 in the afternoon, on December 16th, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's lead Panther tank crested a hill outside the Belgian town of Bullingen and spotted an American fuel dump so large it seemed impossible. 50,000 gallons of fuel sat in jerry cans and barrels, guarded by only a handful of rear echelon troops who surrendered immediately. Peiper's fuel gauges showed his tanks running critically low after just 1 day of combat operations. His entire mission, reaching the Meuse River in 48 hours, depended on capturing Allied fuel. He had found exactly what German planning predicted would be available, but there was a fatal problem. The fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline, and his Tiger and Panther tanks burned diesel. The Americans used gasoline engines in their Shermans, but German armor ran on diesel fuel. Peiper faced an agonizing choice: wait hours trying to transfer usable fuel, or destroy this massive dump and continue westward gambling he would find diesel. He ordered the dump burned and pushed forward, watching 2 years of German fuel production equivalent go up in flames. The entire Ardennes offensive was a fuel equation that never balanced. German planners calculated that reaching Antwerp required each tank to travel approximately 450 kilometers through enemy territory. A Panther consumed roughly 0.6 gallons per kilometer under combat conditions, meaning each tank needed a minimum of 270 gallons just to reach the objective, and that assumed perfect conditions. No combat, no getting lost, no settling while waiting for road clearance. With 1,400 tanks committed to the offensive, the fuel requirement exceeded 375,000 gallons just for the armor, not counting half-tracks, trucks, or return journey. Germany's entire operational reserve was approximately 300,000 gallons. The mathematics were impossible from the start. The plan required capturing 2.5 million gallons of Allied fuel within the first 48 hours. Anything less meant the offensive would stall from fuel starvation. Major Paul Solis, an American quartermaster officer stationed in Stavelot, received frantic orders on December 17th as German forces approached. His position: his depot held 2.5 million gallons of fuel, enough to supply an entire army for a week, and exactly the quantity German planning needed to capture. Engineers had wired the dump for demolition weeks earlier as a precautionary measure. Now Solis faced the decision to destroy supplies worth millions of dollars based on reports that might be exaggerated. He hesitated for an hour, watching the roads fill with retreating American vehicles. When he finally ordered detonation at 2 in the afternoon, the explosion could be seen for miles. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air. The smoke column was visible from Peiper's position 10 kilometers away. The Kampfgruppe arrived in Stavelot 4 hours later, finding only burning wreckage. Peiper radioed back to division headquarters. Enormous fuel dump destroyed before capture, continuing advance but fuel status critical. The pattern repeated across the battlefield with devastating consistency. American supply officers, following scorched earth protocols developed earlier in the war, destroyed fuel dumps rather than allow their capture. At Spa, 75,000 gallons burned. At Trois Ponts, 100,000 gallons. At dozens of smaller dumps scattered throughout the Ardennes, American rear echelon troops set fires and withdrew. German intelligence had correctly identified that the Americans maintained large fuel reserves throughout the region. What they failed to anticipate was the speed and ruthlessness with which those supplies would be destroyed. Within 36 hours of the offensive's start, American forces had demolished more than 2.3 million gallons of fuel, almost exactly the amount Germany needed to capture. The small quantities seized here and there, 500 gallons here, 2,000 there, were drops in an ocean of need. The Luftwaffe's promised air resupply proved equally illusory. German planning called for transport aircraft to drop 200,000 gallons of fuel to Panzer spearheads once they outran their supply lines. The Junkers 52 transport fleet, battered by years of attrition, could barely maintain operations on the Eastern Front. Allocating aircraft for supply drops in the West meant reducing support to armies fighting the Soviets. But the Luftwaffe's fundamental problem wasn't the number of aircraft, but Allied air superiority. The skies above the Ardennes belonged to the Americans and British. Any transport aircraft attempting daylight drops would be massacred by Allied fighters. Night drops were attempted on December 18th and 19th, but winter weather, inexperienced pilots, and desperate fuel shortages meant most aircraft never found their drop zones. Of the promised 200,000 gallons, less than 3,000 actually reached German units. It was another calculation that looked reasonable on planning maps, but collapsed when confronted with reality. By December 18th, just 2 days into the offensive, German divisions reported fuel status that ranged from critical to completely exhausted. The 5th Panzer Army, operating in the center of the assault, reported 70% of its armor units at critically low fuel levels. Movement orders had to be prioritized, which units would receive the limited fuel available, which would sit immobilized while precious hours ticked away. The sophisticated operational plans, with their carefully calculated timelines and objectives, dissolved into desperate improvisations. Tank companies detached individual Panthers to scout for fuel dumps, while the rest of the company waited. Infantry divisions, meant to exploit breakthroughs created by armor, found themselves advancing on foot because their truck transport had no fuel. The offensive's momentum, built on the first day's shock and violence, began bleeding away not from American resistance, but from simple mathematics. Kampfgruppe Piper's advance illustrated the doomed arithmetic with brutal clarity. On December 19th, Piper's lead elements reached a point just 5 kilometers from the Meuse River near Habiemont. They could literally see the river valley, their objective so close that binoculars revealed details of the far bank. But his tanks sat immobilized, fuel gauges on empty, ammunition running low, and no resupply possible. Radio messages to higher headquarters became increasingly desperate. Request immediate fuel delivery. Advance halted due to fuel shortage. American resistance stiffening. The response was always the same. No fuel available, hold position, resupply coming soon. Piper's Kampfgruppe, the spearhead of the entire offensive, Germany's best hope of reaching the Meuse, sat paralyzed within sight of its objective because the fuel equation never balanced. The 2nd Panzer Division achieved the offensive's deepest penetration, reaching the village of Chelles on December 24th. From high ground near the village, German officers could see the Meuse River, their ultimate objective, glittering in winter sunlight just 8 kilometers away. It was the closest any German unit would come to achieving Hitler's goal of crossing the Meuse and driving on to Antwerp. But the 2nd Panzer Division was completely out of fuel. Its tanks and vehicles sat scattered along the road behind cells, abandoned when they ran dry. American forces, alerted to the penetration, began surrounding the immobilized German units. Within 24 hours, the 2nd Panzer Division would be fighting for survival, not victory. The photograph taken from that high ground, German officers staring at the river they could see but not reach, became symbolic of the entire offensive's futility. The failure of the fuel gamble exposed the Ardennes offensive as strategic fantasy rather than realistic military planning. Even if everything else had gone perfectly, complete surprise achieved, American forces routed, weather preventing Allied. Air operations, bridges captured intact, the fuel equation made success impossible. Germany needed to capture 2.5 million gallons of enemy fuel in 48 hours while simultaneously advancing 450 kilometers against armed resistance. It required enemy commanders to abandon vast supply dumps intact despite having weeks of warning about German intentions. It assumed Allied air forces would be grounded for weeks while German ground forces maneuvered at will. Most fundamentally, it ignored the basic principle that modern mechanized warfare consumes fuel at rates that make deep operations without secure supply lines impossible. By December 20th, German commanders from Piper up through Army-level headquarters understood the offensive had failed in its strategic objective. They might continue attacking, might achieve local tactical successes, might even reach the Meuse at isolated points. But the dream of breaking through to Antwerp, splitting the Allied armies, and forcing a negotiated peace was dead. It died not from American heroism or Allied air superiority or even German military incompetence. It died from mathematics. The fuel wasn't there to capture, couldn't be delivered by air, and couldn't be stockpiled before the attack without compromising surprise. The offensive continued for weeks more, consuming tens of thousands of lives and destroying Germany's last strategic reserve. But it was already over. The fuel gamble had failed within 72 hours of the attack's start, and everything that followed was the slow, grinding acknowledgement of that fundamental failure. The morning fog on December 17, 1944, revealed a nightmare to the soldiers of the 422nd and 423rd Infantry Regiments. They occupied positions along the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, a forested highland running north-south near the German border, and as visibility improved, lookouts reported German troops moving behind them. Not patrols, not small infiltration teams, entire battalions. The two regiments, comprising roughly 14,000 men of the 106th Infantry Division, had been neatly encircled during the first day of the German offensive. To their north, the 18th Volksgrenadier Division had broken through. To their south, the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division had done the same. The pincers had closed, and now these American soldiers, most of whom had been in Europe less than a week, found themselves trapped in a Packerer with 3 days of rations, limited ammunition, and orders from higher headquarters that would seal their fate. Major General Alan Jones commanded the 106th Division from his headquarters in St. Vith, 8 miles west of the encircled regiments. His son, a lieutenant, served with one of the surrounded units. Jones faced the most agonizing decision a commander can confront: order a breakout attempt that might save his men but would abandon critical terrain, or hold position and hope relief arrived before supplies ran out. At 10 in the morning on December 17th, he received orders from his 8 Corps headquarters. Defend present positions. Do not, repeat, do not attempt breakout. The logic was strategic. The surrounded regiments occupied terrain that blocked road networks the Germans needed for their advance westward. As long as American forces held the Schnee-Eifel, German divisions would be tied down, reducing the pocket instead of exploiting their breakthrough. Jones was being ordered to sacrifice 2 regiments to buy time for reserves to arrive. He transmitted the order to his trapped men and then sat at his desk with his head in his hands. The men on the Schnee-Eifel didn't immediately grasp their situation's hopelessness. They had foxholes, some artillery support, and the natural defensive advantages of elevated terrain. German probing attacks on December 17th were repulsed with heavy enemy casualties. American artillery, firing from positions that were themselves nearly surrounded, broke up German assault formations before they could close. For one day it seemed possible that the pocket might hold until relief arrived. The soldiers saw C-47 transport aircraft overhead and assumed supplies would be dropped. They heard radio reports that armored reinforcements were racing to St. Vith. What they didn't know was that the 7th Armored Division, supposed to relieve them, was stuck in massive traffic jams 50 miles away, fighting just to reach St. Vith itself. The pocket wouldn't be relieved in 1 day, or 2, or ever. Lieutenant Eric Wood represented a different kind of American response to encirclement. An artillery observer with the 589th Field Artillery Battalion, Wood found himself cut off from his unit on December 17th with about 50 men, a mixture of artillerymen, infantrymen, and support troops. Rather than surrender, Wood led his group into the dense forests and began waging guerrilla warfare against German rear areas. They ambushed supply convoys, cut communications lines, and sniped at German troops moving through supposedly secure territory. Wood, a former college athlete and natural leader, kept his men together through force of personality and tactical brilliance. German units began reporting mysterious attacks by American partisans operating behind their lines. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division diverted an entire battalion to hunt Wood's group. Over 12 days, these 50 Americans killed or wounded more than 200 Germans before being hunted down. Wood himself died fighting, becoming a legend to both sides. By December 19th, the arithmetic of the pocket had become terminal. Artillery ammunition was nearly exhausted, food was running out, medical supplies were gone, and wounded men suffered without treatment. Water was available from melted snow, but frozen canteens were poor compensation for the cold that penetrated every foxhole. German artillery pounded American positions methodically, knowing the trapped force couldn't respond effectively. Luftwaffe aircraft, rare in the skies over the Ardennes, flew unopposed over the pocket, strafing American positions. The promised supply drops never materialized. C-47s couldn't penetrate German anti-aircraft fire, and Allied air commanders refused to risk aircraft for what they increasingly viewed as a lost cause. The men on the Schnee-Eifel were being written off. Colonel George Deschenaux commanded the 422nd Infantry Regiment, with the burden of knowing his men were doomed. On the morning of December 19th, he assembled his battalion commanders and showed them the ammunition reports. Most companies had fewer than 50 rounds per rifle, machine gun ammunition was exhausted, mortar rounds were gone, and the artillery had fired its last shells the previous evening. German forces had tightened the encirclement to the point where American positions were under direct observation and fire from 3 sides. A breakout attempt would mean running a gauntlet of machine guns and artillery with no covering fire, no armor support, and men already weakened by 3 days without proper food. Deschenaux made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would surrender his regiment to prevent its annihilation. At 2 in the afternoon, white flags appeared along the American lines. The surrender unfolded with surreal formality. German officers, many of them professionals who understood the trapped Americans had fought well under impossible circumstances, accepted the capitulation with military courtesy. American soldiers destroyed their weapons, rifles smashed against trees, machine guns disabled, radios crushed, before forming into columns for the march to prisoner of war camps. 7,000 men from the 422nd Regiment became prisoners. The 423rd Regiment, under Colonel Charles Cavender, held out until December 21st, before surrendering another 7,000 men. It was the largest American capitulation in the European theater, exceeded only by Bastogne in the Philippines. The 106th Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting formation, losing 8,663 men captured and another 1,500 killed in action. The strategic calculation behind sacrificing the Schnee-Eifel pocket proved brutally effective. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division, which should have been advancing westward to support the main offensive, spent 5 days reducing the American pocket. The division suffered 10,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and exhausted in the fighting. Critical roads running through St. Vith remained blocked because German forces were tied down, eliminating the surrounded Americans instead of bypassing them. Each day the pocket held was another day for American reserves to move into position, for defensive lines to be established, for the chaotic opening phase of the battle to stabilize into coherent front lines. From the perspective of Eisenhower's headquarters, trading 2 regiments for 5 days was cold-blooded but strategically sound. From the perspective of the men who surrendered, it was abandonment. The prisoner of war column that marched east from the Schnee-Eifel on December 20th stretched for miles. 14,000 American soldiers trudged through snow and bitter cold, guarded by German troops who were themselves exhausted and short of supplies. The march to prison camps in Germany covered 60 kilometers, conducted in the worst winter weather in 50 years. Men with frostbitten feet walked until they collapsed. The wounded, unable to keep pace, were left by the roadside with minimal medical care. More than 300 Americans died during that march, or in the initial weeks of captivity, killed not by German brutality, but by exposure, exhaustion, and untreated injuries. Those who survived would spend the next 5 months in camps, where food was scarce and conditions brutal. Liberation wouldn't come until April, when Allied armies finally crossed into Germany. The small groups who escaped the encirclement wrote a different chapter of the Schnee-Eifel story. Perhaps 2,000 men, individuals and small units who refused to surrender, slipped through German lines in the chaos of collapse. Some, like Lieutenant Wood's group, fought as guerrillas until killed or captured. Others made harrowing journeys through frozen forests, navigating by compass and stars, living on roots and melted snow, eventually reaching American lines days or even weeks later. These men brought intelligence about German dispositions, routes of advance, and unit identifications that proved valuable to Allied planning. They also brought stories of comrades left behind, of officers who chose to stay with their men rather than escape, of soldiers who fought until their ammunition was gone and then destroyed their weapons rather than hand them over intact. The destruction of the 106th Division posed a question that would echo through American military analysis for decades. Was the sacrifice necessary, or could those 14,000 men have been saved? Alternative histories imagine breakout orders given on December 17th, when German encirclement was still loose and roads westward still open. Such orders might have saved thousands of prisoners, but they also would have opened a clear route for German armor to reach St. Vith days earlier, potentially collapsing the entire northern shoulder of the American defense. The commanders who ordered the Schnee-Eifel troops to stand and fight made a ruthless calculation that trading position troops for time was strategically essential. The men in the foxholes paid the price for that calculation, and their sacrifice, willing or not, bought the hours and days that allowed American defenses to coalesce. It was the mathematics of war at its most brutal. Some must be sacrificed so others can be saved. The soldiers of the 106th Division became those numbers, and their surrendered weapons and empty foxholes marked the high-water mark of German success in the northern sector of the Bulge. The convoy of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, rolled through the Belgian crossroads at Bastogne on the afternoon of December 17, 1944, completely unaware they were driving directly into the path of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance. The 140 men traveling in 30 trucks and jeeps were heading south to support infantry units reportedly under attack. They were observation specialists, forward observers, surveyors, communications troops, not infantry, and they carried only light weapons for self-defense. At approximately 1 in the afternoon, the lead vehicles rounded a bend and found themselves face-to-face with a column of Panther tanks. The Americans had no chance. Within minutes, the entire convoy was stopped, the men ordered out of their vehicles with hands raised. They had just become prisoners of war. In 90 minutes, 84 of them would be dead, murdered in a snow-covered field in what would become the most infamous American-suffered atrocity of the Western Front. The SS troops of Kampfgruppe Peiper represented elite formations hardened by years of combat on the Eastern Front, where the war had been fought with a savagery unknown in the West. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Peiper's parent unit, had participated in massacres of Soviet prisoners, reprisal killings of civilians, and systematic murder of Jews and political commissars. These practices, normalized through years of ideological indoctrination and criminal orders, traveled west with the division. Peiper's operational orders emphasized speed at all costs and made clear that handling prisoners would be considered an operational delay. The implication was understood by his subordinates. Prisoners were expendable, and if eliminating them speeded the advance, so be it. This attitude, combined with the stress of combat and the ideological fanaticism of SS troops, created conditions where mass murder became not an aberration, but an expected response. The American prisoners were marched into a field adjacent to the Café Baudarway, about 100 meters from the crossroads. German troops positioned machine guns overlooking the field, while officers searched prisoners for intelligence materials. What happened next remains disputed in details, but clear in outcome. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, without warning or provocation, the machine guns opened fire. The first bursts cut down dozens of men standing in packed formation. Others tried to run and were shot in the back. Some threw themselves to the ground, playing dead beneath the bodies of comrades. The firing continued for several minutes, methodical and thorough. Then S troops walked among the fallen, shooting anyone who moved or moaned. Private Homer Ford, lying beneath 3 corpses, heard boots approaching and held his breath as a German soldier fired a pistol shot into the man lying across his legs. The massacre wasn't isolated to Bastogne. Over the next 6 days, as Kampfgruppe Peiper advanced deeper into Belgium, American prisoners and Belgian civilians were murdered at multiple locations. At Honsfeld on December 17th, 19 American prisoners were shot after capture. At Bullingen the same day, another 50 were executed. At Stavelot on December 18th, civilians suspected of aiding American troops were killed in their homes. At Trois Ponts, La Glise, and Stoumont, the pattern repeated. Prisoners taken, prisoners murdered, bodies left in ditches and fields. The total documented murders attributed to Kampfgruppe Peiper exceeded 350 American soldiers and 100 Belgian civilians. These weren't heat-of-battle killings or accidents, but systematic murders carried out over nearly a week of operations. Homer Ford's survival became the catalyst for American knowledge of the massacre. He and about 30 other survivors had lain in that frozen field for hours after the shooting stopped, waiting until they were certain German troops had moved on. As darkness fell, they crawled from beneath the dead and began making their way toward American lines. Ford reached the town of Malmedy, 2 miles from the massacre site, at approximately 8 in the evening. His uniform was soaked with the blood of dead comrades. He could barely speak from shock and cold, but his story, and those of other survivors who straggled in throughout the night reached American command by midnight. Within 24 hours, photographs of the massacre site had been taken, bodies frozen in the positions they fell, hands still raised in surrender, bullet wounds to the head marking execution-style killings. The evidence was irrefutable. The news of Malmedy spread through American units with devastating speed. By December 19th, frontline troops throughout the Ardennes knew that SS troops were murdering prisoners. Company commanders briefed their men with brutal clarity. If you're facing SS units, don't surrender. They'll shoot you anyway. The photographs were distributed, against regulations but with tacit command approval, showing American bodies in the snow. The effect on American combat behavior was immediate and profound. Units that might have surrendered when surrounded instead fought to the death. Wounded soldiers, unable to retreat, killed themselves rather than risk capture by SS troops. The Battle of the Bulge, already vicious, became even more savage as American forces adopted an attitude of no quarter given or expected when facing Waffen-SS formations. The massacre also generated the opposite response from some American units. Reports, never fully verified, circulated that American troops had begun refusing to take SS prisoners, executing captured SS men in retaliation for Malmedy. Whether widespread or isolated incidents exaggerated in the retelling, these reports reflected a breakdown in discipline caused by the massacre's psychological impact. War crimes tend to generate war crimes in response, creating escalation spirals that make conflicts increasingly barbaric. Senior American commanders, recognizing this danger, issued orders emphasizing that prisoners must be properly treated regardless of German atrocities. But the orders were undermined by the photographs of Bastogne, which made it clear that SS troops couldn't be trusted to honor the laws of war. Joachim Peiper, when later questioned about the massacre, claimed no knowledge of it, suggesting it was the unauthorized action of individual soldiers under combat stress. This defense collapsed under investigation. The murders occurred at multiple locations over 6 days, following a consistent pattern, involving different companies from his Kampfgruppe. The systematic nature proved it wasn't random violence, but reflected command climate and operational practices. Peiper's operational orders emphasized speed over all other considerations, including prisoner handling. His unit came from a division with a documented history of war crimes on the Eastern Front. Whether Peiper explicitly ordered the killings or merely created conditions that made them inevitable is a distinction without practical difference. As commander, he bore responsibility for his unit's actions. The strategic impact of the Malmedy massacre arguably hurt Germany more than it helped. The operational justification, eliminating prisoners to maintain speed, was revealed as meaningless when Peiper's advance stalled for lack of fuel, not from being slowed by prisoners. The murders stiffened American resistance, turning what might have been soldiers willing to surrender into desperate men who fought to the last round. The psychological effect on American forces transformed the battle's character, ensuring that every engagement against SS units became a fight to the death, with corresponding casualties on both sides. Most importantly, the massacre provided propaganda value to the Allies, confirming Nazi criminality and justifying total war against Germany. The post-war reckoning for Malmedy took years to unfold. 73 members of Kampfgruppe Peiper were eventually charged with war crimes. 43 were convicted in trials held at Dachau in 1946. Death sentences were issued for Peiper and 42 others. However, controversy over interrogation methods during the investigation led to sentence reviews and reductions. Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, then reduced to 35 years. He served only 11 years before being released in 1956. His early release generated outrage among veterans organizations and massacre survivors. Peiper showed no remorse, maintaining until his death in 1976 that the Malmedy massacre had been exaggerated and his conviction unjust. He lived in France under an assumed name until French resistance veterans discovered his identity and killed him in an arson attack. The cycle of violence that began in a Belgian field in December 1944 ended 32 years later, demonstrating that some crimes echo across decades, never truly resolved, never forgotten. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery arrived at 1st Army headquarters in Chaudefontaine, Belgium, on the morning of December 19, 1944, and within 15 minutes had completely reorganized the Allied response to the German offensive. General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, was approaching nervous collapse from 3 days of crisis management. His headquarters had been evacuated from Spa just hours earlier as German spearheads approached. Communications with forward units were chaotic. The scope of the disaster remained unclear. Montgomery, fresh from commanding 21st Army Group in the north, assessed the situation with the cold clarity of Britain's most professionally competent, if personally difficult, field marshal. He looked at the map, traced the German penetration, calculated where it could reach if unchecked, and made a decision that likely saved the Allied campaign from catastrophe. British troops would establish an unbreachable defensive line along the Meuse River, while American forces contained the German penetration from the flanks. It was textbook defensive doctrine, and it worked. The British X-Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, had been resting in Holland after heavy fighting during Operation Market Garden. On December 19th, Horrocks received orders to move his entire corps, 4 divisions comprising roughly 50,000 men and 400 tanks, south to the Meuse. The distance from their positions to the river crossings exceeded 200 kilometers through the winter conditions, and over roads clogged with Allied supply traffic. Moving an entire corps that distance in winter was a logistical nightmare, yet British staff officers had it organized within hours. The Guards Armored Division led the movement, followed by the 29th Armored Brigade, 43rd Infantry Division, and 51st Highland Division. They moved in controlled convoy, maintaining unit cohesion while covering the distance in less than 36 hours. It was a masterpiece of military logistics, demonstrating the organizational capacity that set Allied forces apart from their German opponents. By December 21st, British forces had established defensive positions along the eastern bank of the Meuse from Givet to Liège, a distance of approximately 70 kilometers. The 29th Armored Brigade, equipped with Cromwell and Sherman tanks, plus the new Comet tanks mounting excellent 77mm guns, dug in at key crossing points. Infantry divisions prepared demolition charges on every bridge and established anti-tank positions covering the approaches. British artillery, including the feared 17-pounder anti-tank guns that could penetrate even King Tiger armor, registered firing solutions for every likely German approach route. Montgomery's orders were absolute. No German forces would cross the Meuse, period. If necessary, the British would fight to the last man to hold that line. It was the kind of clear, unambiguous directive that allowed subordinate commanders to plan effectively. The German advance toward the Meuse illustrated both the offensive's initial success and its growing problems. The 2nd Panzer Division, part of the 5th Panzer Army's main effort, made the deepest penetration of any German formation. By December 23rd, reconnaissance elements reached Foy Notre Dame and Celles, barely 8 kilometers from the Meuse crossings at Dinant. From high ground, German officers could see the river glittering in winter sunlight. They had driven over 100 kilometers into Allied territory, broken through multiple American defensive lines, and stood on the verge of achieving a strategic breakthrough, but their tanks were running on fumes. Supply trucks were stuck in traffic jams 50 kilometers behind the front. Ammunition was critically low. The division was at the absolute limit of its logistical tether, and British tanks were visible on the opposite bank of the river. The British waited with professional patience. Brigadier C.B. Harvey, commanding the 29th Armored Brigade, positioned his tanks in hull-down positions with only their turrets visible, gunners tracking the German reconnaissance vehicles through their sights. The Germans probed the river crossings at multiple points, looking for weak spots or undefended bridges. They found none. Every bridge was covered by interlocking fields of fire from British tanks, anti-tank guns, and artillery. Attempts to force a crossing at Dinant on December 24th resulted in catastrophic German losses. British 17-pounder guns, positioned to fire down the length of approach roads, destroyed Panther after Panther as they attempted to close with the river. The 2nd Panzer Division lost 82 tanks and assault guns in a single day attempting to break through defenses that were simply too strong to overcome. The fuel crisis transformed what might have been a calculated river assault into a desperate, piecemeal commitment of forces. German tanks couldn't concentrate for a mass attack because they lacked fuel to maneuver into assembly areas. Artillery couldn't provide proper preparatory fires because ammunition trucks were stuck 60 kilometers east. Infantry support was minimal because the Volksgrenadier divisions were still fighting American delaying actions far behind the armored spearheads. The 2nd Panzer Division spread across 60 kilometers of front because its units had run out of fuel wherever they happened to stop, couldn't mass combat power at any single point. British defenders faced German attacks in sequence rather than simultaneously, allowing them to shift forces to meet each threat. It was defensive warfare at its most efficient. Economy of force made possible by German disorganization. Montgomery's tidy battlefield concept, often mocked by American commanders as overly cautious, proved its value in the Meuse defense. Rather than ordering immediate counterattacks to recapture lost ground, Montgomery focused on creating a coherent defensive line that German forces couldn't breach. He accepted that the Germans had created a bulge in Allied lines, the battle's eventual nickname, but ensured that bulge had clearly defined limits. The Meuse River became the western limit. American forces at Bastogne and Saint-Vith created the southern and northern shoulders. Within these boundaries, German forces could maneuver, but they couldn't achieve strategic breakthrough. Eventually, their fuel would run out, their ammunition would be expended, and Allied counterattacks would destroy them. It was patient, professional generalship that valued results over dramatic gestures. The furthest western point reached by German forces was near Kelis, achieved by the 2nd Panzer Division on December 24th. That night, as exhausted German soldiers celebrated Christmas Eve and captured American positions, British forces completed the encirclement of the division's forward elements. The Germans held a salient roughly 5 kilometers deep and 3 kilometers wide, completely surrounded by British and American forces, with no fuel to retreat and no supplies reaching them. It was the high water mark of the Ardennes offensive, 105 kilometers from the starting line, still 345 kilometers from Antwerp, and utterly unsustainable. The division would be destroyed in detail over the following week, its tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, its infantry surrendering in groups as ammunition ran out. The defense of the Meuse demonstrated that Allied forces could respond to crisis with speed and effectiveness that Germany could no longer match. Within 72 hours of the offensive's start, British forces had moved an entire corps 200 kilometers and established impregnable defenses at the critical operational objective. American forces, despite the chaos of the initial attack, were feeding reinforcements into the battle fast enough to prevent German exploitation of their breakthrough. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to support the offensive with thousands of sorties, barely appeared in the skies. Allied aircraft, grounded for the first few days by weather, returned in force on December 23rd and began systematically destroying German supply columns. The balance of forces, which had temporarily favored Germany through surprise and concentration, was shifting back to the Allies with devastating speed. By Christmas Day, 1944, the strategic situation had clarified. German forces had created a bulge approximately 100 kilometers deep and 60 kilometers wide in Allied lines. They had inflicted roughly 50,000 American casualties, captured significant equipment, and temporarily disrupted Allied offensive plans. But they had not crossed the Meuse, had not split the Allied armies, and had not created conditions for negotiated peace. The offensive's strategic objectives were already unachievable. What remained was a tactical battle to eliminate the German salient and destroy the forces committed to it. The British line along the Meuse, unbreached, heavily fortified, and backed by reserves, represented the tombstone of Hitler's last gamble in the West. German troops might fight on, might die bravely, might even achieve local tactical successes, but they would never cross that river, and without crossing it, nothing else they did could matter strategically. The Meuse line held, and with it, Germany's last chance of avoiding total defeat evaporated into the winter air. Brigadier General Bruce Clark arrived in Saint-Vith, Belgium, on December 17, 1944, several hours ahead of the division he supposedly commanded. The town was chaos, stragglers from broken units streaming westward, civilian refugees clogging the roads, rumors spreading faster than facts. Clark commanded Combat Command B of the 7th Armored Division, which was somewhere behind him in a massive traffic jam stretching back 50 miles toward the Netherlands. He had driven forward in a jeep to assess the situation and found himself the senior officer in a critical road junction that nobody had properly prepared for defense. Within an hour, Clark had established a command post in the Saint-Vith Hotel, begun organizing the scattered remnants of the 106th Division, and started planning a defense that would become one of the most successful delaying actions in American military history. For 6 days, Clark's improvised defensive force would hold St. Vith against overwhelming German assault, buying the precious time necessary for Allied defenses to coalesce. St. Vith's importance lay in its road network, rather than any particular defensive strength. 7 paved roads converged on the town, making it the critical logistics hub for the entire region. German forces advancing westward needed these roads to move supplies, reinforcements, and above all, fuel to their spearheads. The town sat in a valley surrounded by forested hills, naturally channeling traffic through its narrow streets. Whoever controlled St. Vith controlled movement throughout the northern sector of the Ardennes. German planning assumed the town would fall within 24 hours of the offensive's start, opening the road network for exploitation. Instead, American forces held it for 6 days, creating a logistics nightmare that contributed significantly to the offensive's failure. The defending force assembled at St. Vith represented every type of unit in the American inventory. Clark's Combat Command B, approximately 4,000 men with 40 tanks, formed the core. Remnants of the 106th Division, perhaps 5,000 men from units not encircled on the Schnee Eifel, provided infantry. The 424th Infantry Regiment, which had escaped the Schnee Eifel pocket, added another 3,000 troops. Tank destroyer battalions, engineer companies, artillery units separated from their divisions, and even a recon squadron from the 14th Cavalry Group contributed forces. Clark commanded approximately 22,000 men of wildly varying experience and capability, organized into an improvised defense that existed nowhere in official tables of organization. The German assault on St. Vith began in earnest on December 18th with elements of 3 divisions, the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier Divisions, plus the Führer's Sigleit Brigade, attacking from multiple directions. The Volksgrenadier formations were fresh from reducing the Schnee Eifel pocket and expected St. Vith to fall with similar ease. Instead, they encountered a coherent defense organized in depth. American forces had established fighting positions on the hills surrounding the town, creating killing zones where German infantry had to advance through open ground under direct fire. Sherman tanks, positioned hull down at key points, engaged German armor at ranges where American 75mm guns were effective. Artillery, firing from carefully surveyed positions, broke up German assault formations before they could close. Clark's defensive concept followed the classic principles of mobile defense: absorb German attacks in forward positions, fall back to prepared secondary positions when pressed too hard, counterattack to restore the line when opportunities appeared. It was textbook tactics executed under nightmarish conditions by units that had never trained together. Communication between different formations was improvised through jury-rigged radio networks and motorcycle couriers. Supply distribution happened through organized scavenging of abandoned American dumps. Medical care was provided in basement aid stations under constant artillery fire. Yet somehow, the defense held together through Clark's force of will and the determination of soldiers who understood they were buying time for the broader Allied response. The fighting for St. Vith was characterized by short-range vicious engagements where American defenders used terrain advantages to offset German numerical superiority. In the Prummerberg sector, a single company of the 81st Engineer Battalion held a critical road junction for 36 hours against repeated German assaults, inflicting casualties of 10-1 before being overrun. At the village of Recht, tank destroyers from the 644th Tank Destroyer Battalion then ambushed a German armor column, destroying 11 Panthers in 15 minutes before withdrawing. American artillery, firing from positions so close to the front that crews could hear German voices, delivered fire missions with devastating accuracy because targets were in direct line of sight. By December 21st, German forces had committed 2 full panzer divisions and supporting infantry to reducing St. Vith, the 9th S Panzer Division and 2nd S Panzer Division, both elite formations that should have been exploiting westward toward the Meuse. Instead, they were stuck hammering against an improvised American defense that refused to collapse. German casualties mounted steadily: 500 killed on the 18th, 700 on the 19th, nearly 1,000 on the 20th. American losses were also heavy, roughly 3,500 casualties by December 21st, but the defenders were achieving their mission. Every day St. Vith held was another day. German supply columns couldn't use the critical road network. Another day their spearheads ran short of fuel and ammunition. Another day for Allied reinforcements to arrive. Clark's decision to evacuate St. Vith came not from German pressure, but from realistic assessment of the tactical situation. By December 22nd, German forces had enveloped the town from three sides, and the last supply route westward was under direct fire. The defense had accomplished its mission, buying 6 days for Allied forces to establish defensive lines at depth. Further resistance would mean the destruction of 22,000 men to gain perhaps one more day. Clark coordinated a nighttime withdrawal, pulling his forces out under cover of darkness in a phased retrograde that preserved unit cohesion. American troops destroyed equipment they couldn't carry, set demolition charges on the road junctions to deny them to German forces, and slipped away through the narrow corridor remaining open to the west. The German entry into St. Vith on December 23rd found a devastated town, but not the triumph they expected. The road junctions were cratered by demolitions, buildings were burning, the approaches were littered with destroyed German tanks and vehicles. More critically, 6 days had been consumed, reducing what should have been a one-day objective. The 6th SS Panzer Army's timetable, already strained by fuel shortages, was now completely broken. Units that should have been fighting at the Meuse were still 60 kilometers east, their logistics completely disrupted. The 5th Panzer Army's northern flank, supposed to be protected by rapid seizure of St. Vith, had been exposed to American counterattacks for nearly a week. The delay cost Germany irreplaceable time at precisely the moment when time was the most precious commodity. The St. Vith defense validated the American military's flexibility and adaptability in ways that formal military academies struggle to teach. Clark had commanded a coherent defense with units he'd never seen before, using improvised communications against a numerically superior enemy under impossible conditions. His success came not from following doctrine, which assumed forces would be properly organized and supplied, but from understanding the principle behind the doctrine. Delay is achieved by making the enemy pay in blood and time for every meter of advance. American soldiers, regardless of unit designation, proved capable of fighting effectively when competently led. The German army, for all its tactical proficiency, couldn't overcome the simple mathematics that reducing St. Vith required more time and resources than its offensive timetable allowed. The evacuation of St. Vith marked the end of the battle's opening phase, and the beginning of sustained defensive operations that would eventually strangle the German offensive. American forces had traded space for time, accepted tactical defeats to enable strategic success, and demonstrated that even green troops could fight effectively when necessity demanded it. The men who retreated from St. Vith on December 22nd had held against overwhelming odds for 6 days, inflicting 10,000 German casualties and destroying 150 armored vehicles in the process. They had preserved their combat power and would fight again. The Germans had taken the town, but lost the battle for time, and in mobile warfare, time is the resource that can never be recovered once spent. St. Vith had cost them the war. The military policeman at the checkpoint outside Liège, Belgium, studied the identification card carefully on the afternoon of December 18, 1944, then looked up at the brigadier general sitting in the jeep's passenger seat. "Sir, I need to verify your identity with some questions." Brigadier General Bruce Clark, exhausted after 2 days organizing the defense of St. Vith, stared at the MP in disbelief. "Soldier, I have orders to get back to my division. This is ridiculous." The MP remained firm. "Sir, regulations. What's the capital of Illinois?" Clark answered confidently, "Chicago." The MP's expression hardened. "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." The correct answer was Springfield, and Clark's tired error resulted in his detention for several hours while his identity was verified through multiple channels. This scene, multiplied thousands of times across rear area checkpoints throughout Belgium and France, demonstrated the spectacular success of Operation Grief, Otto Skorzeni's commando operation to spread chaos behind Allied lines. Operation Grief deployed 44 small teams of German soldiers dressed in American uniforms, driving captured jeeps, speaking English, and carrying forged documents. Their actual missions were modest: reconnaissance of bridge sites, cutting telephone lines, misdirecting traffic at crossroads, and spreading false information about German advances. Scorzeni's original plan called for 500 men, but recruiting that many English speakers proved impossible. The final force totaled approximately 150 men, supplemented by another 1,000 troops in a separate operation called Die Einheit Steylau, who would wear German uniforms but exploit the confusion. The commandos were equipped with 10 captured Sherman tanks and 30 jeeps, all meticulously maintained to look authentic. Their briefings emphasized that wearing enemy uniforms while engaging in combat was a war crime punishable by execution, but they could gather intelligence and commit sabotage before changing back to German uniforms. The psychological impact of grief vastly exceeded its actual operational effect. On December 17th, American forces captured 4 German commandos at a checkpoint near Iwil. Under interrogation, the prisoners revealed, partly through actual confession, partly through interrogator imagination, that Scorzeni's operation involved 500 men, that assassination teams were targeting Allied generals, and that Paris itself might be a commando objective. The interrogation report, circulated through intelligence channels with appropriate classification markings, spread through Allied rear areas with viral speed. Within 24 hours, every American headquarters from battalion level up had implemented draconian security measures. Password challenges became mandatory at all checkpoints. Identity verification questions, ranging from sports trivia to movie stars, became routine. Generals traveled with heavily armed escorts. Eisenhower himself was confined to SHAEF headquarters under guard. The security measures created chaos that far exceeded anything Scorzeni's commandos actually accomplished. 3 million American troops found themselves subject to identity checks at checkpoints that multiplied like mushrooms throughout the rear areas. Traffic that normally moved freely now crawled, as MPs questioned every driver, checked identification, and asked verification questions that many Americans, particularly recent arrivals unfamiliar with U.S. popular culture, struggled to answer correctly. Senior officers were detained because they couldn't name the current winner of the World Series or the lineup of the Chicago Bears. The delay to troop movements averaged 2 to 4 hours at major checkpoints, creating precisely the disruption that Scorzeni had hoped to achieve through sabotage. American forces were doing to themselves what German commandos lacked the numbers to accomplish. The rumor mill generated increasingly elaborate fantasies about Scorzeni's operation. Reports circulated that German commandos were parachuting in, wearing American uniforms. That 50 assassination teams were hunting for Bradley, Patton, and Eisenhower. That German troops were posing as MPs at checkpoints, misdirecting entire divisions. That Paris nightclubs were full of German agents. Some rumors had grain of truth. Captured German soldiers were found with American uniforms and documents. Others were pure fabrication, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The psychological impact created an atmosphere of paranoia where every stranger was suspect, every order potentially false, and every unexpected event possibly enemy action. Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, found himself trapped by security measures implemented to protect him. Guards refused to let him leave his headquarters without elaborate precautions. When he insisted on traveling, his convoy included armored cars and heavily armed escorts. At checkpoints, MPs questioned him extensively about his identity, asking about his birthplace, his wife's name, and details of his career. Bradley, a mild-mannered professional soldier, exploded with rage at what he called this intolerable stupidity. But the security couldn't be relaxed. Intelligence reports, increasingly divorced from reality, suggested that German commandos were specifically targeting American commanders, and Bradley's safety couldn't be risked on his personal frustration. The actual accomplishments of Scorzeni's commandos were modest compared to the panic they generated. Teams succeeded in cutting telephone lines at several locations, though American engineers repaired them within hours. Traffic was misdirected at a few crossroads, creating temporary confusion but no lasting impact. False reports were spread about German advances, but these were quickly contradicted by actual reconnaissance. Several bridges were reconnoitered for potential seizure, but none were actually captured. The most successful sabotage was probably psychological, the creation of an atmosphere where American forces trusted nothing and questioned everything. This mental disruption had genuine operational impact, even though physical sabotage accomplished little. The price of wearing enemy uniforms became clear as commandos were captured. Military law was unambiguous. Fighting in enemy uniform was a war crime, and captured soldiers could be executed immediately without trial. American forces, already enraged by the Malmedy massacre, showed little mercy to captured commandos. Of the 44 teams deployed, 18 were captured within the first 48 hours. The commandos faced military tribunals that were brief and decisive. 8 were executed by firing squad in December, more followed in January. The executions were photographed and documented meticulously to demonstrate Allied adherence to military law. Scorzini himself, captured after the war, faced trial for the operation, but was acquitted on the gate. Technicality that his orders specified changing back into German uniforms before combat, though evidence suggested not all his troops followed these restrictions. By Christmas, the grief panic had largely subsided as the reality became clear. No massive commando army existed, no assassination teams were hunting generals, and Paris was not under threat. The elaborate security measures were gradually relaxed, though not eliminated entirely. Checkpoint procedures were streamlined to reduce delays while maintaining basic security. Senior officers resumed more normal movement schedules, though with more security than before the offensive. The paranoia faded but left a residue of suspicion that affected Allied operations throughout the remainder of the war. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore completely. The strategic assessment of Operation Grief yields contradictory conclusions. As a sabotage operation, it largely failed. Too few men, too quickly captured, accomplishing too little physical damage. As a psychological operation, it succeeded brilliantly, creating paranoia, disrupting communications, delaying troop movements, and consuming Allied attention and resources far beyond the operation's actual capability. Scorzeni had deployed 150 men and created chaos affecting 3 million Allied troops. The question is whether that chaos meaningfully affected the battle's outcome. The delays imposed by security measures may have slowed Allied reinforcement by hours or even a day. But the German offensive was failing for fundamental reasons of logistics and mathematics, not because American reserves arrived a few hours late. Grief was spectacular theater that ultimately changed nothing strategic, though it created memorable moments of absurdity in a brutal war. The conference room at Verdun, France, was freezing on the morning of December 19, 1944. But the ice inside wasn't from the temperature. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had summoned his senior commanders to address the German offensive that threatened to split Allied armies and derail the entire campaign. Seated around the table were men whose egos were as large as their military abilities. General George Patton, commanding Third Army, already bristling at being pulled from his own offensive operations. General Omar Bradley, 12th Army Group commander, whose headquarters had been overrun, and who was sensitive about his forces being caught by surprise. General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group to the south, worried his sector would be raided for reinforcements, and staff officers from SHAEF trying to make sense of fragmentary reports from the Ardennes. Eisenhower opened the meeting with characteristic bluntness. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. Patton grinned. Bradley scowled. The battle for strategic direction was beginning. The military situation on December 19th presented a crisis that would test Allied command unity. German forces had penetrated approximately 60 kilometers into American lines across an 80-kilometer front. 2 American regiments, 14,000 men, were encircled and would soon surrender. St. Vith was under siege. Bastogne was threatened. The 6th SS Panzer Army was pushing toward the Meuse. American casualties exceeded 20,000 in just 3 days. More critically, the psychological impact was severe. This was supposed to be a quiet sector, and the Americans had been caught completely by surprise. Churchill was demanding explanations. The press was beginning to learn of the attack. Stalin, always suspicious of Western Allied intentions, might interpret the crisis as evidence that the British and Americans couldn't sustain pressure on Germany. The strategic implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Eisenhower's fundamental decision was whether to immediately counterattack or first consolidate defensive lines. Patton advocated aggressive action. Let the Germans advance as far as they wanted, then cut the base of their salient and destroy everything inside the pocket. Hell, let's have the guts to let the bastards go all the way to Paris. Then we'll really cut 'em off and chew 'em up. It was classic Patton, bold, aggressive, and strategically questionable. Bradley supported a more measured approach, shore up the shoulders of the penetration, establish defensive lines preventing deeper German advance, then methodically reduce the Bulge. Devers worried that stripping forces from his sector would invite German attacks in Alsace. The British liaison officer present conveyed Montgomery's view. Take time to organize a proper counteroffensive, rather than rushing into piecemeal attacks. The command structure decision proved even more contentious than the strategic one. The German penetration had created a bulge that split Bradley's 12th Army Group, with 1st Army north of the Bulge and 3rd Army to the south. Communications between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and Hodges's 1st Army headquarters had become tenuous. Telephone lines were cut, radio was unreliable, and the roads between them ran through or near German-controlled territory. Eisenhower made a decision that he knew would enrage Bradley. Operational control of 1st and 9th Armies would temporarily transfer to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The British Field Marshal would command all forces north of the Bulge, while Bradley retained 3rd Army and directed operations from the south. It was militarily sensible. Montgomery could coordinate northern forces better than Bradley could from Luxembourg, but it was politically explosive. Bradley's reaction was immediate and bitter. "I'm the sideshow," he protested. Giving Montgomery command of 2 American armies, even temporarily, felt like a vote of no confidence in American command capability. Bradley had worked for months to establish American primacy in the Allied command structure, and now 2/3 of his army group was being handed to a British officer who made no secret of his disdain for American operational methods. The meeting nearly devolved into argument until Eisenhower cut it short. "By God, Brad, those are my orders." The decision was made, but the resentment it created would poison Allied command relationships for the rest of the war and beyond. Patton's promise to attack northward within 48 hours seemed like empty boasting to everyone in the room except Patton himself. Moving 3rd Army's axis of advance from east to north required reorienting approximately 250,000 men and 3,000 vehicles 90 degrees, while simultaneously maintaining contact with German forces to the east. It was the kind of maneuver that planning staffs estimated would take a week under ideal conditions, 2 weeks in winter. Patton insisted his staff had already wargamed a northern attack as a contingency, that movement orders were drafted, and that he could commit 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, to an attack on December 22nd. Eisenhower, desperate for any positive action, authorized the operation despite skepticism from nearly everyone present. The discussion of strategic objectives revealed fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. Montgomery advocated what he called a tidy battlefield, pause current operations, consolidate forces, establish coherent defensive lines, accumulate supplies, and only then launch a properly planned counteroffensive. His estimate was that the Allies would need 6 to 8 weeks to prepare an attack capable of crushing the German salient decisively. American commanders, particularly Patton, rejected this approach as overly cautious. They wanted immediate counterattacks to relieve pressure on surrounded units and prevent Germans from consolidating their gains. The debate reflected deeper tensions: British preference for set-piece battles with overwhelming advantages versus American preference for aggressive action accepting higher risks. The political dimension of the crisis weighed heavily on Eisenhower's decisions. Churchill had invested enormous political capital in the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaign. A major Allied defeat could destabilize his government and undermine public support for continuing the war. Stalin, preparing a massive offensive on the Eastern Front scheduled for January, was watching to see if the Western Allies would maintain pressure on Germany or collapse under counterattack. The American press was beginning to report the German offensive, and how Eisenhower handled the crisis would affect domestic support for the war effort. These political considerations meant that Eisenhower couldn't simply make the optimal military decision. He had to balance military necessity against political reality. The resource allocation discussion demonstrated the overwhelming material advantages the Allies possessed, even in crisis. Eisenhower committed the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, veteran formations resting after Market Garden, to immediate deployment. The 11th Armored Division, freshly arrived from the United States, would move to the Ardennes despite being untested in combat. The British Heck Corps was already moving to the Meuse. Additional divisions could be pulled from relatively quiet sectors or diverted from offensive operations elsewhere. Within a week, the Allies would have more troops fighting in the Ardennes than Germany had committed to the offensive. This force generation capability, the ability to absorb defeats and respond with overwhelming strength, was something Germany could no longer match. The meeting concluded with Eisenhower issuing clear directives. Montgomery would take operational command of forces north of the Bulge and establish an impregnable defensive line. Patton would attack north to relieve Bastogne and threaten the southern flank of the German penetration. Bradley would coordinate overall operations from Luxembourg. Devers would hold his sector with minimum forces and be prepared to send reinforcements north if necessary. Strategic air forces would attack German supply lines and communications as weather permitted. Every available reserve would move to the Ardennes. The Allied response would be overwhelming and decisive. What the Germans had started with violence and surprise, the Allies would finish with mass and coordination. As the commanders departed Verdun, the divergent interpretations of the meeting became immediately apparent. Patton left confident that his aggressive counterattack would save the situation and prove American operational superiority. Bradley left bitter about the command changes and convinced that Eisenhower had caved to British pressure. Montgomery, when briefed on the decisions, was satisfied that sense had prevailed in establishing proper defensive lines, but skeptical that Patton could deliver on his impossible promises. Eisenhower returned to SHAEF headquarters, knowing he had made the best decisions possible under circumstances, but uncertain whether they would be enough. The German offensive had created a crisis. Whether the Allied response would transform that crisis into opportunity remained to be seen. The battle's outcome would be decided not in conference rooms, but in frozen Belgian fields where soldiers fought for road junctions, river crossings, and the right to claim victory from disaster. The column of trucks carrying the 101st Airborne Division rolled through the night toward Bastogne on December 18, 1944, with men still pulling on equipment and loading ammunition. The division had been in France, resting and refitting after the catastrophic failure of Operation Market Garden 2 months earlier. They expected at least another month of recovery before returning to combat. Instead, at midnight on December 17th, orders arrived. Move immediately to Belgium. Destination Bastogne, mission to be determined. The paratroopers, veterans of Normandy and Holland, climbed into trucks still wearing the informal uniforms of rear area life, some without helmets, others without proper winter gear, but all carrying weapons and the grim determination that had made them elite. By dawn on December 19th, the division was established in defensive positions around a small Belgian market town that would become the most famous siege of the Second World War. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the division because Major General Maxwell Taylor was attending a conference in the United States. McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, was a competent professional but not the charismatic leader paratroopers were used to. He compensated with clear orders and unflappable calm under pressure. Upon arriving in Bastogne, he assessed the situation with brutal realism. The town sat at the intersection of 7 major roads, precisely the kind of communications hub that mechanized armies needed to control. German forces were approaching from the east and north, would likely encircle the town within days, and would then demand surrender. McAuliffe's mission was to hold Bastogne regardless of cost until relieved. He organized his approximately 18,000 troops, the 101st, elements of the 10th Armored Division, and various attached units, into a perimeter defense and prepared for siege. The German approach to Bastogne revealed a critical flaw in their operational planning. The town's importance was obvious. The road network made it essential for moving supplies to German spearheads driving toward the Meuse. Yet the initial German plan called for bypassing Bastogne, leaving it to be reduced by follow-on forces while the panzers continued westward. This worked on planning maps, but ignored reality. American forces in Bastogne could interdict every supply route running through the area. By December 20th, the German High Command recognized the mistake and committed substantial forces to taking the town. The 2nd Panzer Division, which should have been approaching the Meuse, was diverted to Bastogne. Panzer Lehr Division attacked from the south. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division closed from the east. More than 45,000 German troops would eventually participate in the siege, trying to reduce a pocket defended by 18,000 Americans. The encirclement closed on December 21st, as German forces cut the last road into Bastogne from the west. American forces inside the pocket now fought in complete isolation, with no ground connection to friendly forces and only sporadic radio contact with higher headquarters. Supply became the immediate crisis. The Bulge division had arrived with minimal ammunition and only a few days of food rations. Winter uniforms were in short supply. Many paratroopers still wore the summer weight uniforms issued for Market Garden. Medical supplies were critically short, and the aid stations were already filling with wounded. Artillery ammunition was rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day, a fraction of normal expenditure rates. The defenders settled in for what they knew would be a desperate fight. The German surrender demand arrived on the morning of December 22nd, delivered by 4 German officers under a flag of truce. The typewritten message was formal and proper. American forces were surrounded, resistance was futile, surrender within 2 hours would be accepted with full military honors. Continued resistance would result in annihilation. The German officers waited while the demand was delivered to McAuliffe. The general, awakened from a brief nap, read the message and dictated his response with characteristic brevity. His initial reaction, "Aw, nuts," became his official reply when staff officers suggested it perfectly captured the American attitude. The typed response, delivered to the waiting German officers, consisted of a single word: nuts. The German colonel, unfamiliar with American slang, asked for clarification. The American officer explained, "It means go to hell." The response became legendary, symbolizing American defiance in the face of impossible odds. The weather became as dangerous as the German assault. December 22nd brought heavy fog and snow that grounded Allied aircraft, preventing resupply and eliminating the air support advantage that American forces relied upon. Temperatures dropped to near 0 Fahrenheit. Soldiers in foxholes faced the dual threat of German artillery and frostbite. The wounded in aid stations suffered without proper heating or blankets. Food was reduced to 1 meal per day of cold K rations. Water came from melted snow. The defenders endured conditions that tested physical and mental endurance as severely as combat itself. Men slept in shifts in frozen foxholes, wrapped in whatever they could scavenge, fighting exhaustion as much as they fought Germans. The weather cleared on December the 23rd, transforming the battle immediately. The skies filled with C-47 transport aircraft, more than 200 sorties over the following days, dropping supplies by parachute to the encircled defenders. The first drops brought artillery ammunition, desperately needed to repel German attacks. Later drops included food, medical supplies, winter clothing, and even Christmas packages intended for delivery before the siege began. American fighter bombers appeared overhead, attacking German positions with bombs and machine guns. The Luftwaffe attempted to interfere, but was hopelessly outnumbered. American P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs dominated the skies, turning every German troop concentration into a target. The siege had become sustainable. The fighting around Bastogne was characterized by close-range, brutal combat, where American defenders used every advantage of terrain and preparation. German attacks followed predictable patterns: artillery preparation, followed by infantry assault supported by tanks, attempting to break through at weak points in the perimeter. American forces, fighting from prepared positions with good fields of fire, exacted heavy casualties for minimal gains. The paratroopers, elite infantry with exceptional training, made every German advance pay a blood price. Tank destroyers, dug in to protect their thin armor, ambushed German Panthers at ranges where American guns could penetrate. Artillery, rationed carefully but employed with devastating accuracy, broke up German formations before they could organize for assault. The relief of Bastogne came not with the dramatic flourish of Hollywood, but with the grinding arrival of exhausted troops after days of combat. Patton's Third Army attacked northward on December 22nd as promised, but progress was measured in meters against fanatical German resistance. The 4th Armored Division led the attack, fighting through multiple defensive lines. Every village was contested. Every hill required assault. The weather that had cleared over Bastogne remained terrible for ground operations. Snow, ice, and freezing temperatures that made movement agonizing and combat lethal. By December 25th, the 4th Armored was still 3 miles from Bastogne, having suffered 2,000 casualties in 3 days of fighting. The actual breakthrough came on December 26th, when Lieutenant Charles Boggess, commanding a small tank infantry team from the 4th Armored Division, crashed through German positions and entered Bastogne's perimeter at 4:45 in the afternoon. The radio message, "This is it," announced that the siege was broken. But relief was more symbolic than practical. The corridor into Bastogne remained narrow, under German artillery fire, and barely passable. German forces continued attacking, trying to cut the corridor and re-establish the siege. The battle for Bastogne would continue into January, with American forces gradually expanding the corridor while German attacks slowly weakened. The siege was broken, but the fight was far from over. The strategic importance of the Bastogne siege extended far beyond the town itself. German forces committed more than 45,000 troops and significant armor to reducing the pocket, forces desperately needed at the tip of the offensive, where the drive toward the Meuse was stalling for lack of fuel and reinforcements. Every day spent battering Bastogne was another day those troops weren't available for exploitation. The siege consumed a full week of the offensive's timeline, transforming what should have been a rapid exploitation into a protracted battle of attrition. American forces tied down 5 or 6 German divisions that would have been available to threaten the Meuse crossings or resist Patton's counterattack. The decision to hold Bastogne rather than evacuate proved strategically decisive, though it came at a cost of more than 2,000 American casualties. The mythology that grew around Bastogne, McAuliffe's nuts reply, the beleaguered paratroopers holding against overwhelming odds, Patton's dramatic relief, became central to how Americans remembered the Battle of the Bulge. The siege had elements that made compelling narrative, clear heroes and villains, dramatic moments, ultimate triumph over adversity, but the mythology obscured the larger reality. Bastogne was one of many critical actions during the battle. St. Vith's defense was equally important strategically. The Meuse River line never broke. Dozens of small unit actions throughout the Ardennes contributed to stopping the German offensive. Bastogne became famous partially because it made good propaganda and partially because Patton's involvement ensured it received attention from sympathetic journalists. The men who fought there deserved their fame, but so did thousands of others whose actions were equally critical but less cinematically compelling. War creates heroes everywhere, but history remembers only a few. The medieval stone buildings of L'Église, Belgium, had stood for centuries, but by December 23, 1944, they bore the scars of modern war. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, the man whose Kampfgruppe had driven deeper into American territory than any other German formation, now found himself trapped in this small village with approximately 2,000 men, 19 immobilized Tiger and Panther tanks, and no prospect of relief. The fuel gauges read empty. Ammunition stocks were critically low. Food was nearly exhausted. 300 German wounded lay in cellars and the village church, suffering without adequate medical supplies. Around the perimeter, American forces from the 82nd Airborne Division and 30th Infantry Division tightened their grip, bringing up artillery that methodically pounded the village. Peiper, who had boasted 6 days earlier that he would reach the Meuse in 48 hours, now faced the prospect of surrender or death. He chose a third option: escape on foot, abandoning everything. The encirclement of Kampfgruppe Peiper had developed with inexorable logic as the offensive's fuel crisis deepened. After capturing Stavelot on December 18th, Peiper's spearhead had pushed westward toward the Meuse, covering nearly 60 kilometers in 72 hours, despite constant skirmishing with American forces. But each kilometer consumed fuel that couldn't be replaced. Promised resupply convoys never arrived, stuck in massive traffic jams, or destroyed by American artillery. Airdrops of fuel never materialized because the Luftwaffe couldn't penetrate Allied air defenses. By December 20th, Peiper's column was stationary, its tanks scattered along the road wherever they had run out of fuel. American forces, recovering from the initial shock of the offensive, began surrounding the increasingly isolated German units. The American response to Peiper's penetration demonstrated how quickly tactical situations could reverse. The 82nd Airborne Division rushed to Belgium from rest areas in France, deployed north of Peiper's advance, and began attacking southward. The 30th Infantry Division, a veteran formation that had fought from Normandy, pushed from the west. Combat Command B of the 3rd Armored Division approached from the south. Within 72 hours, Piper's spearhead transformed from an advancing threat into a surrounded liability. German attempts to relieve the pocket failed. The 1st S Panzer Division, Piper's parent formation, couldn't break through American defensive lines that had solidified with remarkable speed. The hunter had become the hunted. Inside L'Église, Piper faced impossible choices with dwindling resources. His radio communications with higher headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Urgently need fuel and ammunition, cannot hold position much longer without resupply. American pressure increasing. The responses were always variations of the same message. Hold position, relief is coming, no supplies available at present. German doctrine emphasized aggressive action and rapid exploitation, but it provided limited guidance for commanders trapped without fuel in enemy territory. Piper's training and experience were from the Eastern Front, where surrounded units fought to the death or broke out with tanks. Neither option was available. His tanks were monuments of steel rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. The decision to abandon the wounded was the most agonizing Piper faced. Military ethics and German army regulations required caring for wounded soldiers. Leaving them behind violated every principle of military honor, but bringing them on a cross-country march through enemy territory was impossible. Most couldn't walk, and no vehicles had fuel to transport them. Piper negotiated with American forces through a captured American officer held as prisoner. The agreement was simple. Piper would leave the wounded behind with American POWs to care for them, and American forces would provide medical treatment. It was the kind of transaction that occurred in every war, yet for Piper, already implicated in the Malmedy massacre, it carried additional weight. He was trusting that Americans would treat his wounded better than his troops had treated American prisoners. The breakout preparation proceeded with German military efficiency despite desperate circumstances. Every vehicle was drained of remaining fuel to fill demolition charges. The tanks and half-tracks would be destroyed to prevent capture. Heavy weapons were disabled and left behind. Each man carried only his rifle, basic ammunition load, 1 day of rations, and nothing else. The route would lead east through American lines, across the Somme River, and back to German-controlled territory, roughly 15 kilometers through enemy-occupied terrain in winter darkness. Piper organized his 2,200 men into small groups of 30 to 40, each led by officers familiar with compass navigation and night movement. The plan was to infiltrate rather than fight, moving silently through forests and avoiding American positions where possible. The night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, provided the context for Piper's escape that added another layer to the operation's complexity. American forces were celebrating the holiday with whatever modest festivities were possible in combat zones. Guards were still posted and defenses maintained, but attention was slightly relaxed, enough that German troops moving carefully might pass through gaps in the line. Piper waited until after midnight, after American soldiers had finished their Christmas Eve observances, before beginning the movement. The first group slipped out of L'Église at 1 a.m. on December 25th, moving single file through the rubble of the village's eastern edge and into the dark forests beyond. The infiltration demonstrated small unit tactical skills that German troops excelled at, even when strategic situations were hopeless. Moving without lights, communicating through hand signals, freezing motionless when American patrols passed nearby, Piper's men threaded through American defensive positions. They waded through the icy Somme River, water up to their chests, holding weapons above their heads. Officers navigated by compass and stars, maintaining direction toward German lines. When American positions blocked their path, they detoured around them, accepting delays rather than risking combat that would alert the entire sector. It was the kind of professional soldiering that inspired respect even from enemies, tactical excellence in service of a strategically bankrupt cause. The American discovery of the abandoned L'Église came on Christmas morning when patrols advancing cautiously into the village found it eerily empty. The German wounded were where Piper had left them, along with 150 American POWs who had been held by the Kampfgruppe since its initial breakthrough. The Americans found 39 tanks, Panthers and Tigers, sitting motionless with their fuel tanks empty and demolition charges detonated in their engines. 70 half-tracks and trucks similarly destroyed. Mountains of ammunition that German troops couldn't carry. The village's cellars were filled with captured American supplies that Piper's men had looted during their advance but now abandoned. It was a treasure trove of intelligence for American forces and a devastating material loss for Germany. Approximately 800 of Piper's original force made it back to German lines over the following days. Another 400 were killed or captured during the escape attempt. The remaining 1,000 or so had become casualties during the previous week of combat. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive in Kampfgruppe Piper on December 16th, fewer than 1,600 returned to German control in condition to fight again. The casualties were catastrophic, but the equipment losses were even more significant for Germany's deteriorating strategic position. 39 tanks represented roughly 3% of Germany's entire Western Front tank strength, destroyed not by enemy action, but abandoned for lack of fuel. The vehicles could have been saved if German supply lines had functioned, if fuel had been available, if the offensive's fundamental logistics had been sustainable. They weren't. And so, Germany's most elite units left their best equipment rusting in Belgian villages. Piper's escape, viewed tactically, was a masterpiece of small unit operations. Moving more than 800 men through enemy lines with acceptable losses demonstrated exceptional tactical skill. Viewed strategically, it was an admission of total failure. The officer who had boasted of reaching the Meuse was reduced to sneaking through forests on foot, abandoning his wounded, destroying his equipment, and retreating to German lines having accomplished nothing of strategic value. His unit had killed hundreds of American prisoners and Belgian civilians, achieving nothing except guaranteeing his own war crimes trial. His advance had consumed scarce fuel, tied down German reserves, and ultimately contributed nothing to the offensive's success because success was never achievable. The interrogation of captured Kampfgruppe Piper soldiers provided American intelligence with valuable insights into the German offensive's failure. Prisoners spoke of fuel shortages from day one, of promised resupply that never arrived, of air support that never materialized, of traffic jams that made movement impossible. They described divisions that were supposed to be elite but were filled with young replacements with minimal training. They mentioned that experienced officers knew the offensive was doomed, but couldn't say so without risking accusations of defeatism. The testimony painted a picture of a military still capable of tactical excellence, but suffering from strategic confusion, logistical collapse, and leadership that demanded the impossible while providing inadequate means to achieve it. The abandoned tanks in La Glaise became tourist attractions within weeks, photographed by curious Allied soldiers and eventually by journalists who began documenting the battle. The images, massive King Tigers sitting immobile, their guns still pointed westward toward objectives they never reached, became symbolic of the entire offensive's failure. German engineering had produced the most powerful tanks in the world, armor so thick that American weapons struggled to penetrate it, guns that could destroy enemy tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. But all that technological superiority meant nothing without fuel to move them and ammunition to fire them. The La Glaise Tigers were monuments to the reality that modern warfare is fundamentally about logistics, and the side that can supply its forces consistently will defeat the side with superior equipment that can't sustain operations. Piper's personal fate intertwined with the escape in ways that shaped his entire post-war life. He had led his troops with tactical brilliance, conducting one of the deepest penetrations any German formation achieved during the offensive. He had also presided over systematic war crimes that left more than 300 American and Belgian dead in massacres. His escape saved him from immediate capture in December, but ensured his eventual trial when the war ended. The American forces who found the massacred prisoners at Malmedy and other sites would spend years building the case against him. When captured in April 1945, Piper faced justice for crimes committed during those desperate days in December, when his Kampfgruppe had been simultaneously the offensive's greatest hope and its most criminal manifestation. The tanks abandoned at La Glaise testified to tactical defeat. The bodies in Belgian fields testified to moral corruption. Together they told the complete story of Germany's last great offensive in the West. The skies above the Ardennes on January 1st, 1945, filled with aircraft as Allied air power finally achieved the weather conditions it needed to demonstrate overwhelming superiority. More than 5,000 sorties were flown that single day. P-47 Thunderbolts attacking German armor, P-51 Mustangs strafing supply columns, B-26 Marauders bombing road junctions, and British Typhoons firing rockets at any German vehicle that moved. The Luftwaffe attempted its long-planned Operation Bodenplatte, a massive coordinated strike against Allied airfields designed to destroy aircraft on the ground and achieve temporary air superiority. The German pilots, some highly experienced but many barely trained, flew approximately 900 sorties against Allied bases in Belgium, Holland, and France. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed or damaged approximately 465 Allied aircraft, but the Germans lost approximately 300 aircraft in the process, and more critically, lost the pilots, including many instructors and experienced aces who were irreplaceable. It was Germany's last major air operation of the war, and it achieved nothing except accelerating the Luftwaffe's final collapse. The ground counteroffensive that Eisenhower had authorized at Verdun now proceeded with methodical, overwhelming force. Patton's Third Army attacked northward from the Bastogne area with 7 divisions, grinding against German defensive positions that fought with the desperation of troops who knew retreat meant death or capture. Montgomery's forces prepared a more deliberate assault from the north, much to Patton's frustration and Eisenhower's political discomfort. The British Field Marshal insisted on proper preparation, accumulating supplies, coordinating artillery, ensuring reserves were positioned correctly. His timeline called for attack no earlier than January 3rd, possibly later if conditions weren't optimal. This cautious approach was militarily sound, but politically problematic given American eagerness to demonstrate aggressive leadership. The weather that had initially favored German operations now turned decisively against them. Clear skies meant Allied aircraft dominated every daylight hour. German supply columns, forced to move in darkness or face annihilation from the air, couldn't deliver the fuel and ammunition that forward units desperately needed. The freezing temperatures that had grounded Allied aircraft in late December now immobilized German vehicles whose crews lacked proper antifreeze and maintenance materials. Tanks broke down from cold damage, trucks refused to start, artillery pieces froze in position. The German army, already stretched to its logistical limit, now faced an environment that compounded every existing problem. Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal ensured that the German Bulge became a death trap. Professional military logic dictated withdrawing from the salient's western tip, shortening defensive lines, and preserving forces for defending Germany itself. But Hitler forbade retreat, insisting that every meter of ground must be held regardless of cost. His orders, transmitted through military channels but reflecting political rather than military reasoning, doomed thousands of German soldiers to death or capture. Divisions that could have retreated to defensible positions were instead ordered to hold untenable salients where Allied forces could attack them from multiple directions. The Führer's rigid control, which had initiated the offensive, now ensured its consequences would be catastrophic. The American attack from the south, led by Patton's Third Army, exemplified the grinding nature of the counteroffensive. Every village became a battlefield. Every hill required assault. German troops, fighting from prepared defensive positions, made American advances pay heavy prices. The 4th Armored Division, having relieved Bastogne, continued attacking northward but measured progress in hundreds of meters per day rather than kilometers. The 26th Infantry Division fought through the town of Wiltz, clearing buildings one by one in close combat. The 80th Infantry Division assaulted fortified German positions in frozen forests, where visibility was measured in meters and combat occurred at point-blank range. American casualties during the counteroffensive exceeded 1,500 per day, higher than during the defensive phase of the battle, because attacking well-prepared positions always cost more than defending them. The junction of American forces attacking from north and south became the operational objective that would eliminate the German salient. First Army divisions, now under Montgomery's operational control, pushed southward from positions around Spa and Malmedy. Third Army forces drove northward from the Bastogne corridor. The town of Houffalize, approximately halfway between the two forces, became the symbolic meeting point. Capturing Houffalize would cut the base of the German salient, trapping everything west of that line and restoring the front to approximately its pre-offensive position. But German forces defending the approach routes to Houffalize fought with fanatical determination, knowing that once the Allied pincers closed, their own encirclement and destruction would follow. The German withdrawal from the western tip of the salient finally began on January 8th, when Hitler grudgingly authorized limited retrograde movements. By then, it was nearly too late for thousands of German soldiers. The 2nd Panzer Division, which had reached within sight of the Meuse at Selles, was now surrounded and being systematically destroyed. The 9th Panzer Division was trapped near Bastogne with no fuel to retreat and minimal ammunition to resist. Volksgrenadier divisions, already depleted by 3 weeks of combat, disintegrated under Allied pressure. The retreat quickly degenerated into chaotic flight as units abandoned heavy equipment. They lacked fuel to move and fell back on foot through winter storms. German discipline, legendary throughout the war, finally cracked as soldiers realized they were retreating from a battle that never should have been fought. The equipment abandoned during the German withdrawal testified to the offensive's complete logistical failure. American and British forces advancing through recaptured territory found hundreds of German vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, half-tracks, sitting beside roads where they had run out of fuel or broken down from mechanical failure. Many were undamaged, simply abandoned because their crews couldn't move them. Others had been deliberately destroyed to prevent capture, though the demolition was often hasty and incomplete. The material losses far exceeded what Germany could afford. Every abandoned Panther represented months of production. Every destroyed truck was one less vehicle available to move supplies. The equipment losses during the offensive and subsequent retreat consumed reserves Germany needed for defending the Rhine and facing the coming Soviet offensive in the east. The human cost of the counteroffensive fell disproportionately on the Germans because they were conducting fighting withdrawals while Americans attacked. German casualties during January exceeded 50,000, killed, wounded, and captured, compared to approximately 30,000 American casualties during the same period. The casualty ratio, which had favored Germany during the offensive's opening days, when they attacked prepared positions with surprise and numerical superiority, now reversed decisively. American forces, benefiting from air superiority, artillery dominance, and numerical advantages, inflicted disproportionate losses on German troops who lacked mobility and adequate supplies. The Wehrmacht was bleeding at rates it could no longer sustain. The meeting of 1st and 3rd Army forces occurred on January 16th near Houffalize, when patrols from the 11th Armored Division linked up with the 2nd Armored Division. The junction was anticlimactic, a handshake between exhausted soldiers, radio messages to headquarters confirming contact, and the immediate realization that hard fighting continued despite this symbolic achievement. The German salient was eliminated as a coherent bulge, but thousands of German troops remained west of the junction, fighting in pockets, conducting rearguard actions, and attempting to escape encirclement. The battle would continue for another 2 weeks as these isolated formations were systematically reduced. The restoration of the front to pre-offensive positions by late January represented a strategic victory for the Allies, but not the decisive triumph that optimistic journalists suggested. American forces had suffered 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 dead. Belgium and Luxembourg had been devastated, with thousands of civilians killed and entire towns reduced to rubble. The German offensive had delayed Allied operations by approximately 6 weeks, postponing the Rhine crossing from January to March. More critically, the battle had consumed attention and resources during the period when Soviet forces launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive, which advanced 350 miles in 3 weeks and positioned the Red Army for the final assault on Berlin. The Western Allies won the Battle of the Bulge, but the strategic implications were complex. The final accounting of the counteroffensive revealed both Allied strength and German desperation. The Allies had committed more than 700,000 troops to eliminating the German salient, more than had landed on D-Day. They had moved dozens of divisions, hundreds of kilometers in winter conditions, maintained supply lines across devastated terrain, and coordinated operations involving American, British, and Canadian forces under complex command arrangements. The logistical and organizational achievement was remarkable, demonstrating capabilities that Germany could no longer match. But the battle also exposed weaknesses, intelligence failures that allowed complete surprise, initial tactical defeats that cost thousands of lives, and command tensions that persisted throughout. Victory came not from perfect execution, but from the ability to absorb defeats, mobilize overwhelming resources, and grind down an enemy who couldn't replace losses. The German army that retreated across the frontier in late January was fundamentally different from the force that had attacked in December. It had lost approximately 100,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, including a disproportionate number of experienced officers and NCOs who were irreplaceable. Equipment losses exceeded 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, 6,000 vehicles, and countless artillery pieces and heavy weapons. More critically, the offensive had consumed Germany's strategic reserve, the mobile formations and accumulated supplies that might have slowed the Allied Rhine crossing or reinforced the Eastern Front against Soviet attacks. When the Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive struck on January 12th, German forces were fatally weakened by the resources committed to the Ardennes. The offensive, designed to split the Allied coalition and force negotiated peace, instead ensured that Germany would face coordinated assault from east and west simultaneously with no reserves to respond to either threat. Hitler's gamble had failed completely, and the price would be paid in German blood and territory over the coming months. The operations map at Third Army headquarters in Luxembourg showed an achievement that seemed impossible when George Patton promised it 4 days earlier. On December 22, 1944, 3 full divisions, the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry, attacked northward from positions around Luxembourg City, reorienting the entire Third Army axis of advance by 90 degrees. 250,000 men and 3,000 vehicles executed a pivot that peacetime doctrine suggested would require 2 weeks of preparation. Patton had delivered it in 72 hours, transforming Third Army from an eastward-facing force pushing toward Germany into a northward-facing relief column driving toward Bastogne. The staff work was brilliant. The logistics were unprecedented, and the execution demonstrated why Patton, for all his personal flaws and political difficulties, was among the finest operational commanders America produced in the Second World War. The myth and reality of Patton's relief operation diverged in ways that both enhanced and diminished his achievement. The popular narrative, promoted by Patton himself and embraced by journalists, portrayed the Third Army pivot as spontaneous genius, Patton promising at Verdun to attack in 48 hours with no prior preparation, his staff executing the impossible through sheer determination. The reality was more complex and more impressive. Third Army staff officers, aware that the German offensive might threaten their northern flank, had war-gamed a 90-degree pivot as a contingency operation for days before Eisenhower's conference. When Patton made his famous promise, movement orders were already drafted, logistics had been pre-positioned, and preliminary alerts had been sent to subordinate units. This doesn't diminish Patton's achievement, but actually enhances it. He had anticipated the crisis and prepared contingencies while other commanders were still assessing the situation. The physical accomplishment of reorienting Third Army demonstrated logistics mastery that military historians studied decades later. Moving 250,000 troops requires more than orders and maps. Fuel must be pre-positioned along new routes of advance. Ammunition dumps must be relocated to support attacks in different directions. Artillery positions must be abandoned and re-established elsewhere. Communications networks must be reconfigured. Supply convoys must be rerouted without creating massive traffic jams that would paralyze movement. Third Army staff officers working around the clock for 3 days orchestrated this movement while simultaneously maintaining contact with German forces to the east and conducting defensive operations to prevent German exploitation. It was staff work at the highest level of professional competence. The winter conditions transformed every military operation into an endurance test. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit in late December, the coldest weather Belgium had experienced in 50 years. Snow accumulation exceeded 3 feet in some areas, making cross-country movement impossible and limiting vehicles to roads that quickly became clogged. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in some units. Men lost fingers, toes, and extremities to cold that penetrated every uniform and position. Weapons froze and malfunctioned. Vehicle engines required hours of warming before they would start. Artillery pieces had to be heated with blowtorches before they could fire. The logistics of simply keeping troops alive in these conditions consumed resources that normally went to combat operations. The 4th Armored Division's advance toward Bastogne exemplified the grinding nature of winter combat against determined resistance. The division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, was one of America's finest armored formations, with a reputation for aggressive action. But attacking northward through German defensive positions in winter required different skills than the exploitation warfare the division excelled at. Every village was defended. Every road was blocked by destroyed vehicles or prepared obstacles. German anti-tank guns, positioned in ambush, destroyed American Shermans before tank crews even identified threats. The division's advance averaged 5 miles per day, respectable in winter conditions but agonizingly slow when measured against the urgency of relieving Bastogne's garrison. The actual relief of Bastogne on December 26th was less dramatic than mythology suggests, but no less significant. Lieutenant Charles Boggess led a small combined arms team, 3 Sherman tanks and a half-track of infantry from the 37th Tank Battalion, through German positions, south of Bastogne. The breakthrough came not from overwhelming force, but from aggressive action at precisely the weak point in German defenses. Boggess's tanks destroyed 2 German anti-tank guns, overran an infantry position, and crashed through a roadblock before German forces could organize a coordinated response. The radio call, "Come on, this is it," announced the breakthrough to following units, but the corridor into Bastogne remained narrow, contested, and barely passable. German artillery continued shelling the road. Infantry attacks tried to cut the corridor. The siege was broken in a technical sense, but Bastogne remained partially isolated for another week. Patton's personality, aggressive, profane, publicity-seeking, and absolutely convinced of his own genius, shaped both his military effectiveness and his problematic relationship with Allied command. He drove subordinates mercilessly, tolerated no excuses for failure, and publicly berated officers who disappointed him. His diary entries and private letters revealed a man convinced that he was destined for greatness and frustrated by commanders he considered inferior. His relationship with Bradley, his nominal superior, was complex, mutual respect, mixed with Patton's resentment at taking orders from someone he considered less capable. His contempt for Montgomery was absolute, expressed in language so crude that his staff officers feared his letters being intercepted. Yet, this difficult personality translated into operational aggressiveness that achieved results when results mattered. The cost of Patton's relief operation was measured in casualties that mounted steadily throughout late December and early January. The 4th Armored Division suffered 2,000 casualties between December 22nd and January 1st, killed, wounded, and missing in action. The 26th Infantry Division, attacking through some of the most difficult terrain in the sector, lost 1,800 men in the same period. The 80th Infantry Division casualties exceeded 1,500. These losses, approximately 5,310 morts, exceeded what many divisions suffered in months of combat. The relief of Bastogne was achieved, but it consumed irreplaceable veteran soldiers and demonstrated that winter combat in the Ardennes was as deadly as any fighting American forces had experienced in Europe. The strategic question that emerged from the relief operation was whether focusing on Bastogne allowed German forces elsewhere in the Bulge to escape destruction. Montgomery and other British commanders argued that a more patient approach, containing the German salient while building overwhelming force, then crushing everything inside with coordinated attacks from multiple directions, would have destroyed more German units. Patton's aggressive relief attack, they suggested, allowed German forces to retreat in relatively good order rather than being trapped and annihilated. Patton countered that speed was essential, that allowing Germans to concentrate against Bastogne would have resulted in its fall, and that aggressive action was always preferable to cautious preparation. The debate reflected fundamental differences in military philosophy that had characterized Anglo-American relations throughout the war. The comparison between Patton's and Montgomery's approaches to the counteroffensive revealed both men's strengths and limitations. Patton delivered immediate action with characteristic speed, but accepted higher casualties and achieved operationally limited results. Bastogne was relieved, but German forces weren't decisively defeated. Montgomery prepared methodically, minimizing British casualties, and eventually attacked with overwhelming force on January 3rd. But his deliberate approach allowed German units to withdraw that might have been trapped by faster action. Neither approach was definitively superior, but their differences created tension that poisoned Allied command relationships. Eisenhower, caught between aggressive American commanders and cautious British generals, struggled to maintain coalition unity while prosecuting effective military operations. The traffic jams that characterized Patton's relief operation became legendary examples of what happens when multiple divisions try to use limited road networks simultaneously. The roads from Luxembourg toward Bastogne were narrow, winding, and covered in snow and ice. When 3 divisions plus supporting units all tried to move northward on the same routes, massive gridlock resulted. Convoys stalled for hours. Critical supplies couldn't reach forward units because roads were blocked by vehicles that had broken down or slid off icy surfaces. Military police struggled to maintain order as unit commanders, desperate to meet attack timelines, attempted to bypass traffic using routes already congested. The resulting chaos consumed days of time and demonstrated that even the best planning fails when infrastructure can't support intended operations. Patton's diary entries from late December revealed a commander simultaneously proud of his achievement and frustrated by its limitations. He recognized that Third Army had accomplished something remarkable in pivoting and attacking so quickly, but he also knew that the relief of Bastogne, while symbolically important, didn't destroy German forces as he had hoped. His entries bristled with criticism of Montgomery's cautious approach, Bradley's supposedly timid leadership, and Eisenhower's political constraints. They also revealed Patton's awareness that history would judge the Ardennes battle by who took credit for stopping it. His determination to ensure that Third Army, and by extension himself, received recognition for saving the situation drove some of his strategic choices and all of his public relations efforts. The ultimate assessment of Patton's Winter War requires acknowledging both genuine achievement and mythology inflation. Third Army did pivot 90 degrees and attack in 72 hours, an impressive operational achievement. The relief of Bastogne was real and significant. Patton's aggressive leadership inspired his troops and maintained pressure on German forces when other sectors were still reacting to crisis. These accomplishments deserve recognition, but the mythology that Patton alone saved the situation, that his genius was unmatched, and that other commanders were incompetent by comparison is post-war creation rather than wartime reality. The Battle of the Bulge was stopped by multiple forces across hundreds of kilometers. American infantry who held critical positions against overwhelming odds, British troops who secured the Meuse crossings, air power that returned when weather cleared, and logistics that could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Patton's contribution was significant, but victory came from collective Allied effort rather than individual genius. History remembers Patton because he was quotable, controversial, and skilled at public relations. The thousands of soldiers who fought anonymously in frozen foxholes were equally essential to victory, even if their names never made headlines. The snow had stopped falling by late January 1945, revealing a landscape transformed by modern war into desolation. Villages that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble, forests were shattered, trees splintered by artillery, hillsides cratered by bombs. The roads through eastern Belgium and Luxembourg were lined with the wreckage of combat, burned-out tanks, destroyed trucks, abandoned equipment from both sides. And everywhere, scattered across frozen fields and forests, were the bodies. American, German, Belgian civilian. The battle had consumed them all with industrial efficiency. The casualty reports compiled at SHAEF headquarters told the story in statistics that reduced human tragedy to administrative accounting. American forces had suffered 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. German losses exceeded 100,000, with estimates varying widely. 3,000 Belgian and Luxembourg civilians had died, caught between armies that cared nothing for their neutrality. It was one of the costliest battles American forces fought in the Second World War, and the question everyone asked was whether it had changed anything. The equipment losses told a story of material attrition that Germany could no longer afford. 800 tanks and assault guns destroyed or captured represented nearly half of Germany's Western Front armored strength. 1,200 aircraft lost, shot down, destroyed on the ground, or crashed due to fuel shortages and inexperienced pilots, consumed the carefully hoarded reserves that were supposed to defend the Reich itself. 6,000 vehicles of all types, from motorcycles to heavy trucks, eliminated from an already inadequate transport pool. German industry, operating under constant Allied bombing and with critical material shortages, couldn't replace these losses. Each Panther that burned in a Belgian forest was one less tank available to defend the Rhine. Each Junkers transport shot down was one less aircraft to evacuate wounded from Eastern Front hospitals. The material exchange ratio decisively favored the Allies, who replaced their losses from production that outstripped consumption by enormous margins. The strategic impact assessment required evaluating not just what happened, but what didn't happen because of the offensive. Allied plans for January 1945 had called for a major offensive across the Rhine, capitalizing on autumn gains and potentially ending the war before spring. The Ardennes offensive derailed these plans completely. Divisions intended for the Rhine assault were consumed fighting in Belgium. Supplies accumulated for crossing operations were expended in defensive battles and counterattacks. The Rhine offensive was postponed from January to March, giving Germany 2 additional months to prepare defenses, fortify positions, and attempt to negotiate surrender terms with Western allies, excluding the Soviets. From Hitler's perspective, buying 2 months of time justified the offensive's costs. The question was whether those 2 months achieved anything beyond prolonging German agony. The Eastern Front implications of the Ardennes offensive proved catastrophic for Germany. The forces committed to the Western attack, particularly the 6th SS Panzer Army, one of Germany's most powerful formations, came from reserves intended to face the coming Soviet offensive. When the Red Army launched its Vistula Oder operation on January 12th, German defenses in Poland collapsed with shocking speed. Soviet forces advanced 350 miles in 3 weeks, reaching the Oder River barely 40 miles from Berlin. The German units that might have slowed this advance were instead fighting in Belgium or destroyed in the Ardennes. Hitler's gamble in the West ensured catastrophe in the East, and catastrophe in the East made ultimate German defeat inevitable, regardless of what happened in the West. The Belgian and Luxembourg civilian experience of the battle reflected the horror of modern warfare visited upon populations that had already suffered years of occupation. Towns changed hands multiple times, with each occupation bringing new dangers. German troops executed suspected resistance members and destroyed property suspected of aiding Americans. American artillery bombarded towns held by Germans with no ability to distinguish military targets from civilian structures. The winter cold killed refugees who fled fighting with no shelter. Families were separated, never to be reunited. The documented civilian deaths, 3,000, represented only confirmed casualties. The actual toll was likely higher, but couldn't be precisely determined in the chaos. Belgium and Luxembourg had been liberated in September, only to become battlefields again in December. The psychological trauma of reoccupation and second liberation lasted generations. The war crimes reckoning began even before the battle ended, as American investigators documented massacre sites and took testimony from survivors. The Malmedy massacre, where 84 American prisoners were murdered, became the most famous but was far from the only atrocity. Investigators documented 362 American soldiers murdered after capture, plus more than 100 Belgian civilians executed. The evidence, photographs of bodies, sworn statements from survivors, captured German documents, built an overwhelming case that would eventually result in the Malmedy trials. 73 members of Kampfgruppe Piper faced charges in 1946. Death sentences were issued, though most were later commuted. The trials became controversial as defense attorneys alleged coerced confessions and improper interrogation methods, but the fundamental facts were never seriously disputed. SS troops had systematically murdered prisoners, and command climate had enabled these crimes. The command controversy that erupted in February when Montgomery held a press conference proved that political considerations could poison military success. The British Field Marshal, speaking to journalists on January 7th, described his role in containing the German offensive with language that implied British forces had saved American troops from defeat. As soon as I saw what was happening, I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would certainly not get over that river. The statement was factually accurate but politically explosive. American press interpreted it as claiming credit for American sacrifices. Bradley threatened resignation. Eisenhower had to personally intervene to prevent the Allied command structure from fragmenting over Montgomery's tone-deaf public relations. The controversy overshadowed the reality that both American and British forces had performed effectively and that victory came from coordination rather than competition. The American public's understanding of the battle, shaped by journalism and official communiques, diverged significantly from reality. Initial reports emphasized the surprise German attack and the crisis it created. Later coverage focused on American resilience, Bastogne's heroic defense, and Patton's dramatic relief. The narrative that emerged, Americans surprised but ultimately triumphant, individual heroism overcoming initial setbacks, was emotionally satisfying and largely accurate in broad strokes. But it obscured the intelligence failures that allowed complete surprise, the tactical defeats that cost thousands of lives, and the complex reality that victory came from material superiority and logistical competence rather than individual heroism alone. The American public wanted heroes and got them in McAuliffe's nuts reply and Patton's aggressive leadership. The thousands of soldiers who simply endured and fought without quotable moments received less attention, but were equally essential to victory. The German home front response to the offensive's failure demonstrated the terminal disconnect between Nazi propaganda and reality. Goebbels's press releases initially claimed massive victories, American armies shattered, thousands of prisoners taken, Allied coalition collapsing. As the offensive stalled and then reversed, the propaganda shifted to claiming that the operation had achieved its objective of delaying Allied advance and gaining time for Germany to deploy new wonder weapons. By late January, even this fiction became unsustainable as German forces retreated to their starting positions, having achieved nothing. German civilians, increasingly skeptical of all official information, recognized the Ardennes offensive for what it was, a last desperate gamble that had failed and consumed irreplaceable forces. Morale, already low after years of war and bombing, declined further as people realized defeat was now inevitable and would likely come soon. The question of whether the offensive benefited Germany at all produced contradictory analyses that persisted for decades. The case for benefit argued that the offensive delayed Allied Rhine crossing by 6 weeks, forced redistribution of Allied forces away from planned offensives, and demonstrated that Germany could still strike back against overwhelming odds, potentially useful for negotiating surrender terms. The case against benefit pointed to the catastrophic losses: 100,000 casualties, 800 tanks, irreplaceable fuel and ammunition stocks that left Germany unable to defend either the Rhine or resist Soviet advance. The Eastern Front collapse in January, accelerated by the Ardennes offensive's consumption of reserves, arguably hastened German defeat by 2 to 3 months. The balance favors the conclusion that the offensive was strategically counterproductive for Germany, achieving minimal gains at catastrophic costs. The Allied personnel replacement system's ability to restore divisions to combat effectiveness within weeks demonstrated organizational capacity that Germany could no longer match. American divisions that had suffered 50% casualties in December were back at near full strength by late January, filled with replacements from training camps in the United States and Britain. Damaged equipment was replaced from depots or new production. Ammunition stocks were replenished. The divisions were combat effective again, ready for the Rhine crossing. German divisions destroyed in the Ardennes weren't rebuilt. They were disbanded and their survivors distributed to other units. Germany's replacement system had collapsed under the strain of losses on multiple fronts and could no longer maintain division strengths. This asymmetry in reconstitution capability meant that while both sides suffered heavy losses, only one side could recover from them. The long-term impact on veteran soldiers manifested in ways not captured by casualty statistics. Thousands of Americans who survived the battle suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress: nightmares, depression, survivor's guilt, inability to adjust to civilian life. The 99th and 106th Divisions, filled with young soldiers who had experienced the offensive as their first combat, had been scarred by the intensity of those initial battles. Many would struggle with those memories for decades. Belgian civilians returned to destroyed homes and communities forever changed by the experience of occupation, battle, and liberation. The physical reconstruction of villages took years. The psychological recovery took generations. The Ardennes battle left scars across an entire region that remained visible into the 21st century. The final tally sheet compiled by military historians in the decades after the war revealed a battle of superlatives. Largest battle fought by American forces in World War II, largest American surrender in the European theater, most American casualties in any single battle after D-Day, Germany's largest offensive operation in the West after 1940. But superlatives don't capture the human cost. The teenager from Iowa who died in a foxhole never having fired his rifle, the SS officer who murdered prisoners and walked free after 11 years in prison, the Belgian family that lost everything when artillery destroyed their farm, the American general who traded 2 regiments for time and lived with that decision forever. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945, but its echoes continued for decades, shaping how nations remembered the war and how soldiers remembered their service. The battle was won, the salient eliminated, the front restored. But the cost of that victory would be calculated in ways that transcended casualty reports and equipment tallies, touching lives across continents and generations. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl sat in the dock at Nuremberg on April 3, 1946, testifying about his role as Chief of Operations for the German armed forces during the war. The Allied prosecutor asked about the Ardennes offensive, and Jodl's answer was remarkable for its candor. The operation was operationally unsound from its inception. It required simultaneous success in multiple dimensions: tactical, logistical, meteorological, where individual failure in any dimension guaranteed overall failure. This was the man who had helped plan the offensive, who had transmitted Hitler's orders to field commanders, admitting under oath that Germany's last great gamble in the West had been doomed from the start. His testimony, combined with post-war analysis by military historians and interviews with surviving participants, built a comprehensive picture of why the Ardennes offensive failed. The answer wasn't a single decisive factor, but the compound effect of multiple fatal flaws, each individually sufficient to doom the operation, collectively ensuring catastrophe. The fuel arithmetic had never balanced, and this was knowable before the offensive began. German planning documents captured after the war revealed that staff officers had calculated precise fuel requirements. Reaching Antwerp required 450 kilometers of advance through contested territory. Each Panther tank consumed approximately 0.6 gallons per kilometer under combat conditions, meaning 270 gallons minimum per tank just to reach the objective, not counting combat consumption, idling, or the return journey. With 1,400 tanks committed, the offensive required at minimum 375,000 gallons just for armor, before counting trucks, half-tracks, and other vehicles. Germany's entire operational reserve for the Western Front was approximately 300,000 gallons. The plan assumed capturing 2.5 million gallons of Allied fuel within 48 hours. The actual amount captured was less than 50,000 gallons, roughly 2% of requirements. Every German officer from battalion commander upward understood these numbers. The offensive was launched anyway because Hitler insisted mathematical impossibilities could be overcome by willpower. The timeline compression represented another fundamental impossibility. German planning called for reaching the Meuse River in 48 hours, crossing the river by 72 hours, and reaching Antwerp within 7 to 10 days. This assumed continuous advance at average speeds of 15 to 20 kilometers per hour, minimal resistance, all bridges captured intact, no logistical delays, and perfect weather. Historical analysis of mechanized advances shows these assumptions were fantasy. The terrain of the Ardennes, narrow roads through forested hills with numerous river crossings, naturally channeled movement and created choke points where single disabled vehicles could halt entire columns. Even without enemy resistance, moving an army group 450 kilometers in a week through such terrain would have been challenging. With resistance, it was impossible. The actual German advance achieved 105 kilometers in 9 days, less than a quarter of the planned distance in more than the planned time. Even if fuel had been unlimited, the timeline was unachievable. The weather dependency gambled everything on meteorological predictions that couldn't be guaranteed. German planning required 7 to 10 days of heavy cloud cover, preventing Allied air operations. Weather forecasts suggested this was likely for late December, but forecasting weather a week in advance was imprecise, even by 1940s standards. The actual cloud cover lasted approximately 6 days before clearing on December 23rd. Once Allied aircraft returned to the skies, German supply columns, troop concentrations, and armor formations became targets. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest air superiority and was overwhelmed, losing approximately 300 aircraft on January 1st alone during Operation Bodenplatte. The operational plan had no contingency for what happened when weather cleared earlier than predicted. German forces were expected to simply endure air attacks while continuing operations, which proved impossible once Allied fighters and bombers dominated the skies. The Allied response speed demolished German intelligence estimates. German planning documents assumed that Allied forces would require 8 to 10 days to recognize the offensive's scope, redirect reserves, and organize coherent counterattacks. The actual Allied response time was approximately 48 hours. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were moving toward Belgium within 24 hours of the offensive's start. British Kikskayak's Corps completed a 200-kilometer movement and established defensive positions on the Meuse within 3 days. Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees and attacked northward within 72 hours. The German intelligence failure that assumed Allied command would be paralyzed by surprise and confusion proved catastrophically wrong. Allied command structures, despite various inefficiencies and personal tensions, responded with speed and coordination that German planners hadn't considered possible. The strategic reserve depletion represented a decision point where short-term tactical requirements destroyed long-term strategic capability. The forces committed to the Ardennes offensive, particularly the 6th SS Panzer Army and 5th Panzer Army, represented the last significant mobile reserve Germany possessed. These forces might have slowed the Allied Rhine crossing in spring or reinforced the Eastern Front against the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive in January. By committing them to the Ardennes, Hitler ensured that Germany would face simultaneous catastrophic defeat on both fronts with no reserves to respond to either threat. The Soviet offensive on January 12th advanced 350 miles in 3 weeks against German forces depleted by the Ardennes commitment. The Rhine crossings in March faced minimal resistance because divisions that might have defended were destroyed in Belgium. The Ardennes offensive didn't just fail in its immediate objectives, it guaranteed Germany's defeat would be total and swift. The comparison to 1940's French campaign, which Hitler repeatedly invoked to justify the offensive, revealed why historical analogies fail when circumstances differ fundamentally. In May 1940, Germany attacked with material superiority, surprise, superior doctrine, facing an enemy with fragile morale, and poor command coordination. The Wehrmacht was fresh, well-supplied, and facing opponents who had been at peace for 8 months. In December 1944, Germany attacked with material inferiority, achieving only tactical surprise, against an enemy with robust logistics and flexible command structures. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, undermanned, and facing opponents who had been fighting continuously for 6 months and had refined their combat effectiveness through experience. The situations were not comparable, but Hitler's strategic thinking was trapped in past successes, unable to acknowledge that circumstances had changed fundamentally. The counterfactual analysis, what if various factors had been different, demonstrates that no single change could have made the offensive succeed. Assume fuel had been captured as planned. German forces still faced the Meuse defensive line with British reserves that were mathematically unbreachable. Assume Bastogne had fallen. German supply routes would have been clearer, but still inadequate to sustain operations at the Meuse. Assume weather had remained poor for 2 weeks. Allied forces would still have established defensive positions that German forces lacked the strength to overcome. Assume Allied response had been slower. German fuel shortages would still have immobilized armor before reaching Antwerp. The offensive required everything to go perfectly simultaneously for an extended period. Military operations never achieve perfection, and operations depending on perfection are fundamentally unsound. The political versus military logic of the offensive exposed the dysfunction of Nazi decision-making. From a political perspective, Hitler's strategic calculation had a certain desperate rationality. Split the Western Allies from the Soviets, force a negotiated peace in the West, transfer forces east to contain the Red Army, survive until miracle weapons or coalition fractures changed the strategic situation. This political logic motivated the offensive. But military logic, the art of achieving political objectives through organized violence, requires that operational plans be feasible given available resources. Hitler's system had evolved to where political objectives dictated military planning without regard for operational feasibility. Professional military officers who pointed out mathematical impossibilities were dismissed as defeatists. The result was an operation that made political sense in the abstract, but military nonsense in execution. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B during the offensive, committed suicide on April 21, 1945, rather than surrender to Allied forces. His final letters revealed a man who understood that the Ardennes offensive had been strategically bankrupt, but who had followed orders because the alternative was execution for defeatism. Model was a competent professional soldier, trapped in a system where professional military judgment had been subordinated to ideological delusion. His suicide, 13 days after Germany's surrender, was the final act of a commander who knew he had participated in a catastrophe and couldn't live with that knowledge. His death, like the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the Ardennes, testified to the cost of strategic decisions made by leaders disconnected from operational reality. The ultimate lesson of the Ardennes offensive is that superior tactics cannot overcome impossible strategy. German tactical performance during the offensive was often excellent. Breakthrough operations achieved surprise, small unit tactics were professional, individual soldiers fought with determination. But tactical excellence meant nothing when the strategic concept was fundamentally impossible. No amount of tactical skill could overcome the fuel shortage. No level of individual courage could change the mathematical reality that reaching Antwerp required resources Germany didn't possess. The Wehrmacht in December 1944 was arguably the most tactically proficient army in the world, and it achieved nothing strategically because tactics served strategy, not the reverse. The historical memory of the Ardennes offensive demonstrates how popular understanding often diverges from analytical reality. American popular memory emphasizes Bastogne, McAuliffe's Nutt's reply, Patton's relief, and ultimate triumph over adversity. This narrative is emotionally satisfying and contains truth but obscures the larger strategic picture. The battle was won not through heroic stands alone, but through logistical superiority, material advantage, and German strategic bankruptcy. British contributions, securing the Meuse crossings, providing reserves, Montgomery's coordination, receive minimal attention in American memory despite being strategically essential. German participants often remember tactical successes while avoiding responsibility for strategic criminality, Piper's tactical brilliance overshadowing his war crimes, Model's professional competence excusing his service to a criminal regime. The final accounting reveals an offensive that failed at every level except the tactical. Tactically, German forces achieved surprise, broke through American lines, advanced over 100 kilometers, and inflicted heavy casualties. Operationally, they failed to capture critical objectives like St. Vith quickly, lost the race for the Meuse crossings, and consumed irreplaceable forces. Strategically, they achieved nothing positive and much that was negative. No split in Allied coalition, no negotiated peace, no transfer of forces to defend against Soviet attack. The offensive accelerated Germany's defeat by 2 to 3 months rather than delaying it. The casualties were catastrophic, the material losses unsustainable, and the strategic consequences disastrous. The Ardennes offensive stands as testament to what happens when political delusion drives military planning, when strategic objectives are defined without regard for operational feasibility, when leaders confuse willpower with capability, and when tactical excellence is squandered in service of impossible goals. Hitler ordered the German military to violate the laws of logistics, the constraints of geography, the limits of materiel, and the principles of sound strategy simultaneously. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical proficiency and individual soldier competence, couldn't achieve the impossible. Physics won, mathematics won, reality won. The offensive failed because it had to fail, because it was conceived as fantasy and executed as tragedy, because no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome strategic impossibility. The tombstone for Hitler's last gamble in the West should read not defeated by enemies, but destroyed by its own contradictions. An operation that was doomed before the first artillery shell fell on December 16, 1944.